This podcast is brought to you by CDkeyoffer.com. Use offer code BrokenSilicon to save 25% on all Microsoft software. And also use offer code BrokenSilicon to save $30 on the Minis Forum V3 3-in-1 tablet. We'll talk about these sponsors more later, but for now, let's just get on with the show. Welcome to Broken Silicon, a gaming hardware podcast. I am your host, Tom, and today the guest is someone who came on almost half a year ago. I would say, because I know you spoke with Wendell at Level 1 Techs, you spoke with me. You were essential to really breaking the news on the Intel Raptor Lake flaws. So I really would recommend people listen to that episode too. It's a very good one, I thought, one of the better ones. And I actually do want to start there just to kind of, for the people who didn't watch that episode or maybe forgot that whole saga that was all anyone was talking about for 2 months, I would say, maybe more than 2 months. Like, just what was the whole Raptor Lake flaw thing based on? We're months away from it. To your memory, how has it ended up in your mind? And yeah, what have you done? I mean, I think we all deserve an update. Like, you had tons of cost imposed on your company by these Raptor Lake failures. What has become of all this for you?
Sure. So yeah, with the Raptor Lake thing, we're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars of problems and damages, and we prepaid for 14th gen servers for years as well in advance. A lot of companies will prepay for their server for a year. So that becomes a particular problem where you find out all the servers are defective. So it ended up being, 6 months of finding out it was broken, and ended up sending data to Wendell and various other companies, Gamers Nexus and reviewers, and saying, "Hey, please cover this. This is broken. Intel is not fixing it." And we ended up swapping everything over to AMD, and we're buying Zen 4 servers like crazy now, and it's solid. And we still have 10,000 crashes, a day from our player base that still have these CPUs, but on our side, we just have them banned company-wide. On average, every 5 minutes, a Raptor Lake user crashes in our game still.
Which please tell people what your games are as well.
Yeah, I work on Path of Titans. It's a dinosaur survival game. Been working on 5 years now.
So, because I remember, I don't want to regurgitate the conversation we had too much, but I remember, God, it's already 2025. I think it was late 2023. I had a contact of mine in retail telling me, by the way, we get a lot of Raptor Lake returns, and then it started to boil and boil and boil more and more and more until it's like, because at first I think there was this thought of like, well, Raptor Lake uses more energy. Rocket Lake had more failures than Comet Lake, which had more failures than Coffee Lake, I was told. But then over time, it was like, oh no, it's not just like 20% more. This is like a lot more. And, there's the oxidation issue that I don't even remember what really came of that. I'm pretty sure Intel's been being sued over some of these things right now. And then it just, from what I was told of people at Intel, they believe there really is just a flaw in the ring bus. And I think this has kind of been extra proved recently. And I've seen a lot of people on Twitter, like Silicon Gang types, like, why is Arrow Lake's ring bus clocked so low? It's like, yeah, I was directly told that's why Raptor Lake failed, is because the ring bus was clocked too high. And I was told by people who worked on Alder Lake that they were very worried about that, and that's why they didn't push Alder Lake's ring bus crazy high. So there you go on that one. But I guess my question is, after all has been said and done, do you think this information got to enough people? Do you think that this has been even remotely resolved enough?
Yeah, so I think this is kind of being buried and covered up by Intel, because most systems are not going to get that BIOS fix even if it works, right? I don't know if it's still been long enough to conclude if it's perfect or not, but without it being a Windows update forced thing on people, or there's a message that pops up in Windows that says, hey, you're missing this critical fix, your PC is going to die, which they don't want to do for the PR backlash. it's gonna people PCs is just gonna keep dying en masse.
And I am listening. I just occurred to me. I'm going to text someone in retail right now. Are you still getting tons of Raptor Lake returns? Because I'm honestly curious on that one. I mean, because I know you in your games, you have a thing pop up, right? If it crashes, that's like, hey, just so you know, it's because of Raptor Lake. Please don't spam us on Reddit, don't you?
Yeah, we started working on a tool that will we hard-coded every BIOS version in the tool to try to detect every motherboard revision and every BIOS revision to try to check if someone's patched. Because we don't want to annoy the user with an error message of something they've already patched. But there's OEMs that have BIOS updates that have not shipped the BIOS update to customers, or the BIOS update blocks, certain BIOSes not flagged with a certain OEM code from even updating. So there's people that, bought it from a system integrator and then they haven't got the fix. And games just crash. And when you talk to users that have this defect, I can send them Windows video or a Games Nexus video. And they're like, yeah, but only your game crashes. What do you mean my CPU is effective?
But that's not true. I believe there's another developer that also has that sort of warning, at least one other one. You're not the only one to my memory.
Yeah, but to the end consumer, it's, I didn't get a crash. I play your game, now it crashes. And you kind of have to go into this, well, Unreal Engine 5 is super optimized and it will crash earlier. And customers just generally don't believe you.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to pull to try to get them help. And I have people with Dell where they had a Dell PC and they tried to get an RMA on it. It was broken. And Dell just said, no, we're not RMAing this. So I'm like, man, that's kind of scamming the customer, right? So like, how many of these RMAs and system OEMs, even though Intel's, supposedly accepting RMAs, how many Dell systems out there are getting rejected because Dell's like, hey, you want a different processor, buy a new PC. Like, we're not RMAing this. That's kind of rough.
Yeah, I just got feedback from that person I told you, everyone here, that I texted. They said, yep, they still get a lot of Raptor Lake returns, but they don't sell them anymore. So
I wonder why.
Proportionally, I believe it's the same. So they still just seem to be failing a lot. They just don't carry them anymore. And there's a lot of kind of, especially like mom and pop pre-built companies that are kind of done with them as well. Although I assume the larger the company, the more you just can't do that because you've got this huge contract with Intel.
Yeah, my server provider that I was using buys their CPUs directly from Intel. And they were saying that, hey, they just don't want to carry Intel CPUs anymore because of the way they handled it. And as far as I know, they still haven't got RMAs accepted on some of these processors. And, what do you do there, right? You sue Intel. Maybe it's not worth suing Intel. You waste a whole bunch of time suing them, and you're not really providing your game service. What's the point?
I mean, I guess, I see Schottenjäger wrote in with a question, but I think we pretty much answered all of his questions already with our conversation. So I'll just try to put a bow on this one by asking, I assume you talked to Intel. I mean, has it been followed up with a decent amount or not? Because at first Intel acted, oh, we're earnest, we want to help everyone.
Yeah, so I had a call with Intel, and most of this call is under NDA, so I can't share too many details. But the public info I can share is they were horrible on the call, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like there was an Intel gaming lead there, and they were talking at like half the call was disagreeing with each other, saying, "Oh, I've been working at client Intel for 20 years, and I think you're wrong, and the floor is not here." And like Intel engineers disagreeing with each other on the call. The call was like 6 or 7 people, and it was, for a development relations standpoint, it was horrible. It was like, this sounds as bad as all my other vendors that have really bad relationships with. They offered to buy, I think, laptops off me that had the Raptor Lake floor on laptop, because that is still underdeveloped story, because a lot of those laptops still hasn't got fixes or BIOS updates or, I guess, acknowledged en masse. But I ended up not sending that stuff to Intel because I was worried that they wouldn't just be honest with me, and because they could just buy my laptops and say, hey, the laptop's actually not Raptor Lake defect. It's
put
something
out
else.
A press conference,
or
right, like a press
run
release
or whatever, right?
And then say, but don't worry, we sent to Alderon Games, out of the generosity of our hearts, a bunch of free laptops anyways, just in case, but also we're not giving you the other ones back.
Yeah, they said, oh, we'll buy new laptops for you. And I'm like, what, are you going to buy new Intel laptops for me? Like, I don't want them, right? So
Yeah, because
I
the
ended
man
up,
hour issue is the bigger problem. I mean, speaking to people in retail and pre-built and OEMs, like they're like, yeah, I mean, the cost of the CPU is a big deal, but some of these major companies get deals with Intel. Well, they'll be getting like i7s for under $200 in bulk, and they're like, it's the problem is actually assembling the PC, and we're worried about how much we're gonna have to pay people to fix everything. I assume for you, it's like, well, you just don't want someone in your studio to have to lose a bunch of work, right?
yeah, the processors, honestly, if we lost all the money on the hardware itself, it wouldn't matter. You know, you just buy new equipment. If the time and wasted money and, oh, the fix is coming, it's going to be the next one, we swear, and there's 5 more fixes.
Mm-hmm.
And it's that kind of thing where, you know, in the Gamers Nexus video, Intel was, you know, handling the PR where he'd ask them a question, and Intel would silently edit their post with a different answer.
Oh yeah, I forgot.
Without
Intel
even
literally
replying. So you're just dealing with someone that's hostile at that point. And why would you engage with that, right? So I ended up stop engaging with them. I ended up sending the laptops to some reviewers so they could independently confirm it. But you know, we've kind of avoided Intel. I'm kind of at the point now where I want to consider sending a mass email out to my customers about the Intel thing next, or at least if we detect a crash, we send the customer an email and say, hey, you know, the CPU's dying, please fix it.
It's funny when I just 10 minutes ago brought this up to you on the show, I was like, oh no, I might be underprepared. I probably should have looked around, but it doesn't seem like I have been underprepared really. Like it just seems like there hasn't been progress. Really? I mean, am I wrong?
Yeah, I mean, basically the problem is even if the fix works, there's no mass messaging to customers to say go update, right? And a lot of RMAs are getting rejected still. So until some new story kind of blows up about, you know, the lawsuit or Intel, you know, suing somebody or whatever, we're still kind of in a stalemate. And it's in the best interest of everyone to just move on and don't buy Intel product again. That was a mistake. My server provider said, hey Matt, these 14900Ks can do 6 gigahertz in boost mode and they're really awesome, but the fix nerfs performance. Right? I remember Intel telling me, he's like, hey, well, we'll make sure the fix doesn't nerf performance. I'm like, oh man, that sounds like months of work working with Intel engineers to try to make the performance work. I don't want to mess with that.
Yeah. So I guess the final thing I would say then is I don't know what I can really do. I guess it's occurring to me. I just texted someone when we were talking, but there are a handful of people I could follow up with to see if there is progress on this, how they would summarize it. I don't know if that would really, I'm just being honest with everyone. I don't know if that would be a video that gets a ton of clicks because unfortunately the way news cycles work is people pay attention, hyperventilate for a month, and then it just like it never happened and people forget it. So I think it would at least be worth an update on some broken silicon though, as a portion there. And hopefully, you know, like Gamers Nexus was really angry in that video, but I hope they will follow up and let Wendell and other people will too, because, you know, again, just texting someone and they're like, oh no, we still get tons of returns of Raptor. Like, it's like, I guess this is just, it would be unfortunate if how this ends is tons of them keep breaking, and that's the end of the story. But
successfully for Intel, successfully buried. And they just have to kind of deal with Arrow Lake being a mess, you know, currently is the next thing.
Yeah, it's funny to think about how they rushed out Arrow Lakes, assuming this would be the thing of it that saves everything. But now people are almost more excited for Bartlett Lake or something. So, all right. So I thought we had to talk about that in the beginning there. But as you can probably see by the light changing behind me, I think we have to talk about Blackwell here. I mean, it was, of course, the main reason that we delayed recording this episode. You know, we were originally going to record Sunday, like usual when I record. And then I was like, well, you know, there's an AMD and an NVIDIA press conference. Maybe we should wait. And then, I mean, I think that was a very, very good idea that we did, because, I mean, there's a lot to discuss here and I don't even know where to start. So when it comes to the 5090, the 5080, the 5070 Ti, and the 5070, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I guess it's kind of interesting with comparing it to Intel's keynote and AMD's keynote before that, because it was a very strong contrast between them. You know, the Intel one kind of just mentioning AI, the AMD one kind of cut off and didn't really mention RDNA that much.
Well, I don't know if it mentioned it at all. They just put out a separate press release.
Yeah, there was a weird Xbox thing in there where they talked about kind
that
of
was
RDNA vaguely, and they're like, Matt Booty is promising that RDNA 4 is going to be the best or something without mentioning any of it. And
even though they don't even have an elite console for Xbox, so why would you bring on Xbox to talk about that?
The thought I thought was, are they going to have FSR 4 for Xbox or something, and that's why this guy's here?
That would make sense if they did that.
It didn't seem like it though, right? With NVIDIA's keynote, the interesting thing that was mentioned was there was a price anchoring that took place of a $10,000 PC. Jensen talked about how you're going to buy the 4090 and it's going to go into this $10,000 PC, and the 4090 is kind of cheap compared to your $10,000 PC. So this is really good value, and you're going to be able to upgrade it. And then we saw the 5090 with the increased price.
Yeah, I mean, I had to put that in the video I put out last night, too. I mean, that was hilarious to me. I'm reminded of, I think her name was Lucille Bluth or something, the grandma in Arrested Development. There's this scene where they're like losing money, and she's like, but she's always been this rich, spoiled woman. And she goes, well, how much can a banana really cost? $10? And then her son goes, oh my God, you've never bought groceries in your life, have you? And it's like $10,000 PC. My PC has a 4090, and it's not the craziest thing. It's not like I have like Gen 5 SSDs or 9800 X3D or something, but I think the total PC is probably below $3,000. I don't think you're gonna get to $10,000 unless this is a workstation.
Well, I'm in the $16,000 PC club for work, but
we have Threadripper, I assume.
Yeah, I like Threadripper. But even now, I'm like, should I really upgrade? I mean, I have to pull my water cooling loop apart, but yeah. So those specs released. There is a concern I had about the 5080 kind of being cut in half 5090 in terms of like the RAM is cut in half, a lot of the core counts reduced and stuff like that. That the gap between the 5090 and the 5080 is increasing.
And it continues to increase every generation. I mean, just to remind people, I mean, God, how far back do I really want to go? Like, NVIDIA's been trying to do this for a while, have the 80 actually be quite far away from the TI, the 90, the Titan, whatever it is. Ever since they could get away with it, frankly. I mean, all the way back like 20 years ago, you can find weird, expensive cards they made. But it really started, I believe, with like Kepler, where they had the 980 and the 970 with the 104 die. And then later, actually, the next generation, they released the 102 die with the, or whatever it was, I think a 110 die, maybe, I don't know what they called it back then, with the Titan, and then a 780. And then to Maxwell, again, they had an 80 Ti that was the top die. Then they go to, Pascal, and they've been continuing to shrink the 80 class smaller and smaller relative to the top one, for the most part. And now we're at a point where, yeah, I mean, it looks like it's less than half. I mean, even if it's the full die, it's less than half the top die. And so you bet it better be, like like half the price of the 5090.
Yeah, it gave me this vibe that the 5090 is really like this Titan card compared to the card below it, because the differences. I did notice that there was a huge amount of claims being made like crazy.
Right. We got to get into those.
It was stuff like, this uses 50% less power consumption, as in somehow NVIDIA's cooked up some magic and it's 50% less power usage. We saw stuff like, was it the 5070 being the same performance as a 4090 or something like that? Like, incredibly crazy claims made. And there was a lot of, I guess, kind of demo video footage of, DLSS. It really looked like a cinematic shot, and then it kind of turned into like a game gameplay footage. And there was kind of crazy frame rate numbers of, on the left that have 30 FPS, on the right that have 300 FPS or something crazy.
Yeah, I'll probably have Gerard show that video on screen here as well, because like when the conference started, all right, let's actually get the weird stuff out of the way first. I mean, you mentioned there's the $10,000 PC thing, which tells you Jensen's at a level of money where he has no clue what things cost anymore that are outside of his immediate view. You had him weirdly walking on stage with a shield. For me, the weirdest thing actually was the first 5 minutes where a guy, like one of his lackeys, walks out and just praises him as a guy who worked at Denny's, and he's got faith and drive, and it's like whoa, we're just starting with ego here.
He was a dishwasher, and he came from nothing, and now he's a super genius. And it
Mhm.
was a CES event organizer, and this is the thing that was super weird for me because
Oh,
we
so
were.
he was a CES person, not NVIDIA. That makes it even weirder because that means they
Yeah,
felt
so
like they had to do
it's
that.
kind of like, and I get this at GDC with game developers, where depending on how much money you pay, you get a different size booth, right? And you get a different time slot. And I'm wondering if NVIDIA has paid the most money to CES to be last, to have the most time with this giant stage. And you have your CES lackey come on and say that you're a genius. And, those are intro videos like NVIDIA's curing cancer and amazing and,
Last time I
and
checked,
stuff
it's not
like
cured
that.
yet, but
Yeah.
we're always curing it. It's never happened though. But
Yeah, it can
let's
be.
talk about it when you do it. Okay, let's just cut to that when you actually accomplish it with your AI.
And
But
there was a jacket, which is, interesting.
when you see stuff like that, this is just saying, people, like when you see stuff like that that looks that silly, that means no one around Jensen tells him no anymore. That's what that tells you. So we're getting full ego here, going into the show. None of that surprised me. There's just more than I've ever seen before. They start revealing the 5090. The specs are what's been leaked. Nothing surprising to me. It honestly does look very impressive. The first red flag, yeah, 5070 is strong as a 4090, but they don't tell you how much VRAM it has. That's when the alarm bells just went crazy for me. I'm like, no, it's not, man. It isn't. And if you look at the charts, and I analyzed this, like I actually measured their own bar chart on their website, and where's the halfway point? As far as I can tell, the 5070 in the one game that they hand selected, mind you, it still had some ray tracing turned on, so we don't have a pure raster comparison. It looked 20 to 35% faster than the 4070, which places it, where I was told, around a 4070 Ti, maybe a little stronger. That's not a 4090.
The problem with that one game that we have that's technically ray traced is they could have just
Far
upgraded the
Cry
ray
6.
tracing. Yeah, Far Cry 6. They could have just upgraded the ray tracing core, and we wouldn't really know a good reflection of normal raster performance,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I noticed the laptop pricing looked pretty reasonable because the price was for the whole laptop and not the GPU or anything. So stuff started immediately not adding up to me, where it's like power consumption 50% faster. This thing's a 4090 now. That didn't really add up. And I was looking at the language Jensen was using, and he'd say stuff like, "This wouldn't be possible without AI" and stuff like that. So I'm more getting the impression that DLSS is doing some heavy lifting. There is fake frame generation happening as well, with three fake frames and one upscaled frame. So I'm kind of concerned about the numbers looking promising, but the actual context of it being not really a huge upgrade.
Yeah,
My
I
main
mean,
issue is
again, like when I don't even write down half the claims because I know they're all nonsense. But
that.
like you say that they said like at half the power or something. It's like, well, yeah, I mean, but how are you counting the frame? Is the 4090 running without the extra frame generation, and then you're capping it at 240 hertz or something? Because if that's what you're doing, it's using half the power because you're generating half the frames.
Yeah, if the GPU stops doing stuff and waits for the next frame to happen, it uses less power. Like, I don't understand how these claims were impressive unless they're in context that explains why the power. Because on a 4090, you could lower power consumption by 50% just doing some changes to settings, right? So that's probably the most concerning thing. And I'm seeing a lot of benchmarks and posts about comparing frame gen with non-frame gen results and saying, look how good the card is now, when we know those fake frames don't take that much to produce from the compute standpoint. And it's very misleading on the numbers. And the fact we only get one cherry pick game that has RT, which is Far Cry, is concerning to me. They could have had a whole slide with raster games as well, but that just was not a thing. Intentionally not true.
Yeah, and so again, it's like I could piece apart all the specs, but I mean, we just need to see third party reviews. And this is no different than before. It seems to be, well, I guess I don't know, actually. We're gonna have to give it a week. This was yesterday. I went to sleep at like 5 a.m. Actually, I think I fell asleep at 4 a.m. on the couch. Then my girlfriend woke me up while she was going to work, and I went upstairs and went to bed for another few hours. It's not like I've had the time at all since this press conference that was at night yesterday and started late to really look at how people are thinking about this. All I can say is when it first happened, it feels like the reactions I saw on like Reddit, the Discord, YouTube comments, the initial reactions seem to be taking NVIDIA at their word more than 2 years ago. But I think we have to remember 2 years ago, NVIDIA claimed that the 4070 Ti, which at first they called the 4080 12 gigabyte, would be 4 times faster than a 3080 Ti. It was 10% faster. And I don't know. I mean, so when I see them claim a 5070 is 2 or 3 or whatever they say times faster than a 4070, it might be 20 to 30% faster. And I think that's kind of where we have to leave it, besides, this unknown of if their neural compression, which I have a picture Gerard can put up as well, where they like compress something. I think it was, actually, let me just open it since I can't put it up for myself. They have an example where they compress some texture that's 4096 by 4096 from 256 megabytes to, I think that's 3.8 megabytes. Okay, yeah, I mean, that's a lot of compression. I can actually tell it, though. It doesn't look lossless at all, although it's a small part of a texture, I guess. So they might argue you don't notice. They say that, did they say like neural face or AI face? I don't even know what that means. Like they had all these different ways that AI is going to compress and enhance the graphics without actually taxing the GPU. But we don't know if that will just work or not, how many games that will work in. And again, like, I think people need to remember that Starfield, which didn't have DLSS right away, there was a hack to add DLSS. It added a lot of artifacts, and that's what happens. Devs do, and you're developers. This is where I kind of want you to chime in here eventually. Like, you do have to do your own work to make sure DLSS and FSR don't have artifacts, right? Even though NVIDIA acts like it just works.
Yeah, so the concern for me was there was compute shaders that was mentioned about compute shaders doing machine learning. We haven't really seen how many games are going to add that in and how hard that is to support. But it looks interesting, but without the context or seeing a game with it, it's kind of hard. For the upscaling and frame gen and DLSS stuff, there's kind of a split the industry's going in, where one side is like upscale, we don't care about artifacts or noise, we're going to render at 1080p and upscale to 4K, super sample everything. And the other side of the traditional rendering side is image quality is king, we're going to render in 4K, everything's going to look perfect, we don't need any anti-aliasing. And there's a huge split, and NVIDIA's led the industry with, it's okay if we do ray tracing because we're going to downscale the resolution by 50% to make the ray tracing work. And, it's okay if we do, DLSS because we're going to add NVIDIA Reflex, and that's going to fix the latency. And we've seen stuff like Reflex 2, which is going to preemptively predict where the next frame's going to be, where your mouse is moving, which is a little bit weird from my standpoint, because unless you waste a whole bunch of time ray tracing stuff, your input's going to be really quick. So if you need to make 4 fake frames, for example, your input latency is going to be really high. So they're going to make another fake frame that has the camera in a different spot to like make the input latency less. It really gave these Google Stadia negative latency vibes, where
I forgot about that. Yeah.
This sounds like some kind of, I'm sure in some cases it might be cool, but your game has to be very wasteful on resources to need the latency fix thing from NVIDIA. And it's kind of like this house of cards where at the bottom you have a 1080p render, and then we add ray tracing, which slows it down. And then we add DLSS to try to get the performance back. And then we add Reflex or Reflex 2. And then we need this neural network to downscale the textures because the performance is so bad. And I'm wondering at what point people realize, this isn't bad. This isn't good for image quality. There's artifacting, there's blur. This is a bad direction to go in. But because AMD and Intel are so far behind and they're copying NVIDIA features,
Right.
NVIDIA's got this black well pulling people in. That's like, games already added ray tracing, so your GPU better support faster ray tracing.
You better have DLSS,
right?
and you better use it, or ray tracing is going to give you really low frames unless you're using DLSS.
So, and all these features, if you use DLSS by itself on a non-ray trace game, your performance is actually lower in a lot of cases because the game isn't bottlenecked. Only when you bottleneck the game is the performance increased when you're using DLSS.
I've noticed that with some games with PSSR as well.
So I'll be in Path of Exile 2, I'll be like, okay, let's upscale from 1080p to 4K, and my FPS is down versus rendering natively in 4K. So, like, what's the point of using DLSS unless I add ray tracing and really slow the game down? Right?
Yeah.
And maybe people really like ray tracing and don't care about image quality, in which case this GPU is amazing and great. But if you care about image quality and this stuff makes you sick and your input latency is really bad and you don't like some of this rendering stuff, this is not going to be the great direction to move forward in. And it really depends how many gamers notice or care or, experience motion sickness from this stuff, right?
Yeah, I mean, we've already seen with like the 4090 versus the 7900 XTX that obviously on average overall it's a lot faster. I mean, it can be over 30% faster. I'd say on average it's more like 15 to 20% faster unless you crank up ray tracing. But there are games where the XTX matches or beats the 4090 depending on how the game chooses to render things, and AMD doesn't have a competitor to the 5090 this time, but it would not surprise me if there are some games, especially ones heavily influenced by NVIDIA, that use a ton of ray tracing, DLSS, and all these features, and the performance looks incredible. And then there's games where it only beats the 4090 by 20 or 30%, which is crazy to me because it has double the bandwidth, or almost it's got an absurd amount more bandwidth and CUDA cores. But again, to the people that think I'm acting crazy here, I mean, I'm looking at a chart that NVIDIA has provided themselves of the 5090 over the 4090. And it looks like it's 30% faster in Far Cry 6 than the 4090. That's really, really low to me, even just based on the specs on paper. But they chose to show that game, which is odd. So it could be all over the place depending on the game you're playing.
So the weird thing is that's their cherry-picked game. That might be the best case scenario. So are we going to see some games where it's a 5 or 10%, 15% performance uplift in raster performance for a 4090, and it's so much more expensive that it's what is the point of buying this
for gaming, at least?
Unless you're doing the ray tracing and unless you're doing all these effects that are better on the new GPU.
This piece of content is brought to you by CDkeyoffer.com. Just in the past few weeks, Dan built a new PC with a fresh install of Windows 11 on a blazing fast Gen 5 NVMe SSD. And of course, that code for Windows 11 came from CDkeyoffer.com. And we've been using CDkeyoffer.com at Moore's Law Z for a very long time. I use it for my office software on both my desktop and my laptop, and that's because they're reliable. They've always been there for us, and they offer reasonable prices for Microsoft products that are usually set, in my opinion, at monopolistic pricing. And they're actually having a Christmas super sale right now. So if you're looking to get the best pricing on Microsoft software or games or other products on their website as well, please show support for a company that's shown support for the Moore's Law is Dead team and community for years by using offer code BROKENSILICON to get 25% off all Microsoft software and DieShrink to get 3% off everything else. So support Moore's Law is Dead by checking out CDkeyoffer.com today. And I guess I think you kind of answered, but I just want to try to get a concrete one to make sure it is answered. This neural compression and the way they're going to predict the next frames. Yeah, what's your gut reaction to how well that will work, though?
So
because on paper they could argue that an 8 gigabyte card is like a 24 gigabyte card now. I just have a hard time believing that's going to work.
The compression thing looks interesting, but for our games we already use Oodle texture compression. It's already really good. So I
I
wonder
see.
if that compression comes in more on ray tracing workloads and it's not as suitable on other workloads. Because the whole running out of VRAM thing people keep going on about is I turn on ray tracing and ray tracing destroys my VRAM, and I run really high texture quality textures and you just run out of space. So it looks like it could be good, but on the other side, the latency, NVIDIA Reflex 2, or what it was called, um, it concerns me that they're like, hey, we need to predict where the camera's going to be next frame because our frame takes 50 milliseconds to render. Like, I'm used to making games where at 60 FPS, it's 16 milliseconds, and there's not a lot of delay, right?
Mm-hmm.
And how accurate is this thing going to predict where the next frame is? If you're turning the corner and there's a bad guy there, the machine learning is not going to know the person's there. It's going to guess a bunch of pixels that may or may not be there. Do people really want a competitive shooter where they turn around a corner and
There's two enemies.
maybe like it reminds me of this tech where they're using satellites to kind of scan the Earth, to figure out to map it, right? And there's two companies. There's a company that's like, we're gonna use an algorithm to predict what the pixel could be accurately, and there's an AI company saying we're gonna run machine learning and have it guess, and it will put planes in there where there's no planes in the images. And if this is a military contract company, do you really want a fake plane in your image, right? So
I mean, no, people have probably seen footage of like helicopter gunners, and it's like the most grainy, horrible looking camera you've ever seen, but it is accurate, and that's all they want.
So, if there's a thing that, and I guess this also depends how many frames are you guessing. Like, a lot of people don't know, NVIDIA has a setting in the driver where they can generate 16 frames if they want to, but they've set it to be 5, right? And generating a new frame isn't that impressive compared to rendering it normally. Like, it's hard to use it as a comparison. And I think depending on the player's personal view, if frame gen is not a issue for you, you're going to like the GPU. But as a developer, that I want to control everything on the frame. And if there's a bug, I want to make sure that if there's flickering in the corner somewhere, am I going to go to one of my developers and say, "Oh, that's just the NVIDIA thing. Good luck fixing that bug. It's in a model you can't edit or can't control."
And that's something I wanted to touch on too. Like, as a developer, how does this worry you? Because I think, again, already, like, I've had you on, Brian Heemskirk, someone who both worked at Sony Santa Monica, and I believe now works, I think it was Sledgehammer or Treyarch. He works on a Call of Duty studio now. Like, these are people working on very big games, some of them, all of the an Unreal Engine dev on. And one thing that comes up from you and every developer I speak with is how often gamers are like, why doesn't this have FSR or DLSS? Because it's not just DLSS. It's like, why doesn't Metro Exodus have FSR support? Why does it? And it's like the developer has their game, they've finished it, and they're worried if they add another one, it will break it, right?
Yep.
And how much does just seeing it almost feels like this is a Pandora's box of things you're going to have to worry about. How much does that worry you?
Yeah, so with us, we upgraded to Unreal 5.5 recently, and our community is like, what do you mean you change your engine? Where's our nanite, lumen, megalites, DSSR, FSR, XeSS, reflex 2 neural temporal material thing? It's like, my God, that sounds like there's 30 features I need to add that are constantly moving that might break the game, that NVIDIA might break in a driver update next week. That sounds really complicated. And if we add in DLSS and our frame rate doesn't go off because we're not using ray tracing, it's going to be pretty pointless, right? That's a concern. So gamers it's not really communicated in the marketing material what this frame gen thing actually is and how to fix your game very well. And no one really understands, like, the frame rate kind of goes up, that must mean it's better. If we added a button to the game that just showed a higher number on the FPS counter without it doing more FPS, some people would say, oh, my game's better. The number says 200 instead of 120 now. Is the game actually better there? And as a developer, it does feel like someone coming into your game and messing with the pixels and frames and adding problems and bugs that weren't there before. And if I have to beg NVIDIA and say, NVIDIA, please fix your model. I have this one bug, one area that's causing people to have seizures. Am I going to get support for it? I don't know. It sounds like a mess to me.
Yeah. So, and you would agree. We just don't know. We don't know if there will be issues. We don't know how much of this will. It just works. We don't know how much of this is going to require dev input until we have review day. And we're watching Hardware Unboxed or something or Gamers Nexus, and they're like, these are the 5 or hopefully all like 100 games that actually already support it, and there's no issues. Or if that's not going to be the case. But again, what I can say about performance is when I look at the actual chart handpicked by NVIDIA, the handpicked game, the one game without like full ray tracing, or one of the only full games, is Far Cry 6 from 3 years ago. And it looks like most of these cards are 20 to 40% faster than their predecessors, not doubling, which again makes me two minds about it. I on the one hand, that's within what I expected, although on the lower end for some of them. And so I'm like, well, okay, so it's it's on the lower end of the expected performance. The 5090 is pretty much exactly where I expected it to cost. 5070 Ti, slightly cheaper. 5080 is cheaper than I expected it to. Although if you look at the memory speeds and stuff, it kind of seems like they use cheaper components than they might have been considering, and they're making it possible to be a little cheaper than initially intended. And so my overall takeaway is just like, it seems decent, but if DLSS 4 is not all it's hyped up to be, it doesn't really impress me more than Lovelace did. If it's Black Magic, then sure, this seems crazy, but it would have to be Black Magic. And I hope that it is for gamers, but also just like, if what Jensen just showed on stage, none of it happens, I think we're at the peak of the AI bubble. Like, that's what tells me, all right, here, like you said, here's the Google Stadia presentation that wowed everyone that didn't happen. Like the guy walked out in this jacket that no one told him looks ridiculous because no one tells him no anymore. He held up a shield and acted like a gladiator. And then, pets.com. Like, that's what I'm going to say happened if this doesn't deliver as well as they say it will. But if it does, it is hard for me to see how the competition catches up to this anytime soon. I'll say that.
I'm sure there might be a subset of stuff that get delivered, like 25% of the stuff he says or 50% of the stuff he says, but without marking it in the context of the reason why it uses 50% less power is because of DLSS, and without DLSS it doesn't use less power. We're gonna find all those answers out in the reviews.
Mm-hmm. All right. So Quick Jumper writes in and says, what is the current competitive landscape, in your opinion, between DLSS 3, FSR, and I suppose XE Super Sampling 2, in terms of game adoption and implementation quality? With FSR 3 reportedly reaching over 50 supported games, how does DLSS 3's adoption compare? And what patterns do you see emerging in real-world quality of frame generation implementations between these technologies?
So the thing I like about DLSS 3 and FSR 3.1 is supposedly DLSS 4 and FSR 4 will be a in-place upgrade without a lot of developer work. Like, that sounds great. That sounds very future-proof. I'm pretty disappointed that they had this whole NVIDIA Streamline thing that was supposed to be a code once and then magically your game will support all 3 pipelines. But it seems like Intel and Tom Peterson does not like Streamline, and didn't bother integrating it with NVIDIA or getting it to work due to disagreements. So the thing that I hate the most is I have to add 3 different GPU vendors' code into my game using 3 different sets of plugins. These vendors are not Unreal Engine experts. Like, they don't code a plugin that is Unreal Engine perfect. It is NVIDIA doesn't know how to use Unreal, so they made a plugin that might work or might not work. That's kind of the vibe I get from all 3 of them. So there's different bugs and code standards between all 3 plugins. And sometimes they fight with each other too. So we'll put the DLSS plugin and it'll break PS5, even though PS5 doesn't use DLSS.
Of course, right? Yeah.
Which are like trying to talk to NVIDIA and you're like, hey, PS5 is broken. And they're like, well, I can't help you with that. Sorry. Right? Great.
Yeah.
But in terms of the feature set, I think DLSS is getting a lot better. I think FSR was nice because it was super open, but I'm concerned about it being closed off now as a closed off thing. And Intel released Battlemage marketing XeSS 2. It's in one game so far that not running it super well, and is not released to developers. And I emailed Intel about it, and they said it was launching in January, and we still haven't heard about it yet. So I'm generally concerned about Intel not following up on their promises. And not to mention, there's a whole bunch of comments made by Intel about it being open source and open platform, and they're going to support it for everybody, and that kind of disappeared and doesn't run on Linux and stuff like that. So it's kind of concerning.
Yes, and that was something that stunned me. I believe that was actually one of the things we were talking that made me say, "Hey, maybe you should come on again soon." Is you're saying Xe super sampling too? Like Intel isn't talking to developers at all about it.
Yeah, so there's one game that supports it. Like, it's been what, a month since Battlemage came out?
Launched.
There's the so-called launch, and it's been the B, was it 870 or
B580?
What was it? The one wasn't that B570?
No. Well, there is a B570 that should launch in a week.
So that's launching a week from now, and we still haven't seen XeSS 2. No one's adding support for it for games except one game. I don't think that's going to get a lot of adoption. You know, if AMD is struggling with FSR adoption, Intel is over in the corner eating glue over here, and I'm very concerned that this is going to be a mess to maintain of 3 different plugins. I've got to go buy every single GPU now. Like, I have to go buy a 5090 or whatever, add support for whatever crazy thing Jensen's cooked up. For every GPU vendor, this is a crazy amount of support. Like, it's not like I implemented DirectX 12 API and all these features work for all the GPUs or all the ones that support automatically. It's kind of like Android development where I need to go buy. I have this. I guess I don't know if you see it. This like rack of currents.
Oh yeah, I do. Yeah.
In a wood box here, where I've bought like 50 Android phones, and I have to go test every single one. This Snapdragon one supports this. This other one supports this. This one does ray tracing. This doesn't, and it's a maintainability mess. So I think the standard that will win is not the one that looks the best, but the one that is most open to developers and most supported. And if I email NVIDIA next week, am I going to get a reply from the dev support saying, we're here to support you on adding this new feature or not? Right?
Probably more likely than Intel emailing you back.
Intel, I emailed them. I'm thinking, man, are these guys going to hate me because I called them out on the Raptor Lake thing? Am I even going to get a reply? Yeah, I even said, hey, look, I'll sign an NDA. I'll add XeSS to, no worries about it. No, can't get access to it right now. So it's kind of wrong.
I mean, this is the part where, I ask, like, how different is it to support Battlemage over, I mean, not even just NVIDIA, right? There's Blackwell, Lovelace, Ampere, and then Turing's really entirely different from Ampere. And Turing is certainly entirely different from Pascal, which you still have to support, of course. Like, how much work goes into not just supporting Battlemage versus NVIDIA, but also supporting 5 NVIDIA architectures?
Yeah, so the hard bit from the gaming side is, unless NVIDIA and these GPU vendors go out to game developers and say, hey, we're going to send you money, we're going to give you support, we're going to please add these features. Like, adding a feature that just works on the 5090, for example, would suck because only a small percentage of people buy a 5090s, right?
Which they have. That's what they're going to do again.
We're kind of betting on what kind of adoption of GPUs. Like, if Intel sells 100 Battlemage GPUs, is it worth supporting?
That'd be a big month for them.
Right? That is the question. Now, I would like to see, as a developer, I want to support everything. I want to support everything, even if it's not popular, because I wouldn't want someone to play my game and have a bad time. But there is an economics factor of NVIDIA. Like, you could just support NVIDIA and you've got 73% of the Steam hardware survey.
Mm-hmm.
It's really hard to justify doing the others. We kind of do them because we care, not because...
and so if you're like 0.5%, although does Battlemage being in Lunar Lake make a difference? Although I guess I have to admit, Arrow Lake, which is Probably with the overwhelming majority of laptop CPUs will be actually, I believe, is Meteor, like, what is that? So then Alchemist Plus or Alchemist Plus Plus. It's some variant of an enhanced Alchemist. It doesn't use Battlemage. But like, so actually, yeah, Battlemage might be like the least ubiquitous Intel gen ever. If you think about it, because I bet Celestial is in a lot more APUs than Battlemage will be. But like, does Battlemage, I guess, being in Lunar Lake, and were it to have been in Arrow Lake, would that have meant, oh, well, there's no question we're going to support this a lot? Or is the difference between like Alchemist and Arrow Lake, an Alchemist and Meteor, like an Alchemist on desktop, are those different enough where no, it's not that simple of like, well, we have to support it because it's an Intel's integrated graphics, which are everywhere. The dedicated one really is its own beast.
Yeah, so the problem we ran into with Battlemage and some of the other Intel iGPUs is a lot of our customers will show up with a 6th gen Intel CPU or a 10th gen Intel CPU even, and Intel abandoned the drivers for them, right? So we get like thousands of users a month, for example. They show up, they don't get any NVIDIA drivers. Some people have a CPU that is 2 years old and the GPU driver is already abandoned by Intel, right? So there's a bad track record of this.
Yeah, you're pointing that out to me too, behind the scenes, because you saw a lot of tech tubers for some reason going, oh, because Tom Peterson,
he said it's going to last a long time.
Who has never lied before, by the way, said that it's going to get a lot of support. We're just going to believe it, even though Intel's canceled drivers after 2 years.
Yeah, so for us, when we see a driver canceled, the game runs at 45 FPS on an Intel iGPU, and it's perfectly fine. The only thing is Intel abandoned the driver, and now the driver crashes. And so we go to get support for that, and they just say, hey, it's abandoned, right? You can imagine the most popular thing they've released that's the most available is abandoned. How the hell do you think Battlemage is going to go, right? So you have to hope that, like, if I spend, developer time adding Battlemage support, is Intel going to help me, and is it going to work? And the issues I run with Battlemage is I'll pull out my GPU and I'll connect an Xbox controller, and the Y button for Xbox will be the wrong color. And I'm like, how does a 2D image, like let's say the A button's green, on Battlemage it's just like orange, right? And you're like, how does this 2D image of a button that we're just showing as a button prompt, it completely the wrong color and broken because of the driver? And you're like, how much else in the game is going to be like there's flickering, there's all sorts of weird problems.
Right, so you're opening, to support Battlemage, you're opening up a can of worms of like all of these tickets you're going to have to open with Intel.
There's like thousands, like, and getting one ticket, like we have a bug with NVIDIA where our shadows flicker since we've upgraded Unreal Engine 5. And let's say a bug in the driver. We've fixed it on AMD because AMD's driver is a lot more open, but the NVIDIA drivers are very locked down. And so if I'm looking at these tickets, like, okay, Battlemage is going to be, months of work, and I'm going to have to open up 200 tickets with Intel. And Intel is not the best at communicating. We can't even get XeSS 2 on a GPU that's a month old launched. How are we going to get these 200 tickets fixed? Right? And we could spend, like, a single ticket could take 2 months to fix for one developer who's been doing this for 10 years, right? Unreal Engine does not care about Battlemage, right? So you have this problem where you're now going uphill against like fixing epic stuff to work with Battlemage. And I play, I have a B580 and I've run games like Dishonored, and I'm seeing artifacts in that game, right? It's like a multi-year-old game from 2016. I've run a game Dishonored from 2013 or whatever it is, and it's broken on Battlemage. And I'm seeing these hardware unbox videos saying performance on old CPUs is really bad. And you're thinking, man, I kind of regret buying this thing, man. This thing's a mess. Like, all the reviewers had positive reviews on this thing, and we didn't realize CPU performance on it really sucks on slow CPUs.
Well, I want to say this too. It's not just on older CPUs.
Even
you
on
need
modern,
a 9800 X3D to consistently beat a 4060. Like, and this is the most eye-opening for me. Like, you can go to Zen 4 and there's games where there's just 20% performance swings. And what's going to happen when next gen games come out with higher CPU demands? Like, I think we're going to start to see soon some games on PC go, all right, consoles have had 8-core Zen 2s for a while. That's the minimum requirement now. What is that going to do then I think, I guess what I'm saying is it's not just older CPUs. I would make the argument anyone who is realistically considering Battlemage does not have a CPU probably good enough. I mean,
if you can't afford an expensive GPU, you're not buying the most highest end CPU. And
mm-hmm.
it's not like Intel's testing this thing with Arrow Lake, which is even worse performance on it compared
I
to
forgot
last
about
gen.
that. Yeah.
I guess an interesting note in AMD's keynote is they went out of their way to crap all over Arrow Lake.
My eyes actually glazed over during that because I'm like, I didn't talk about it in the video I put out yesterday, or I guess by the time this comes out, I guess it may have been 2 days ago, but it's like, yeah, Arrow Lake lost. I know.
And I don't even know if that's the fixed version of Arrow Lake that didn't really get fixed, or if it's the worst version from earlier. But
but yeah, and I just want to say this disclaimer too. So, like, guys, I've gotten a lot of hate for saying it seems like Battlemage is really not a good option. Here's a person who actually works on it. This is their opinion. I talk to people, and that's where I get my opinions from. You know, I don't just benchmark it on a $500 CPU and then go, it's great. Like, this is where my opinions come from, is actually trying to understand, like, will you be able to buy it? Will it get the support? Behind the scenes, are the people building the games saying it's going smoothly? It, to me, does not seem like it is. But let me ask this, because this actually dovetails a little bit into RDNA 4, but I think we could tie this to Battlemage. Transpose 1195 writes in and says, one of AMD's goals for RDNA 4 is greater market share and therefore greater developer support. Is there a market share percentage above which support for things like FSR start to become less optional? Can AMD get there with a strong showing this year? And I also want you to answer that question just in context of Battlemage. Like, at what market share do you have to support all AMD features? I know you don't have to, but
yeah.
I think you would agree. You feel like you have to support all DLSS and NVIDIA features because of the market share. This is common sense. It's like, of course you would feel that way.
So there is an argument to be had for game developers that even though, say, Intel has, what is it, less than 1% market share or something like that, it might be worth supporting because your game's going to get some publicity from benchmarks and Intel might advertise your game. And so, like, when I asked for XeSS, Intel was like, hey, we'll mention you on your social media, or just add XeSS support. So there is a bit of a novelty factor of, even if AMD doesn't have market share, you can be in their driver installer and you can be in their Adrenaline software, and they could upload a video to your YouTube channel. So
when you're updating your AMD drivers, it'll be like, it'll say like Dishonored 2 while you're installing or something,
So there is a bit of incentive from game developers where there's this hidden incentive of, if we support AMD or we support NVIDIA, NVIDIA is going to help us out. Maybe they'll reply to our tickets more faster. Maybe they'll assign dedicated developers to support us. So there's a bit of a, even if this feature makes no sense to add in, it still might be worth adding in just to check this box where you're going to get more support. So that's kind of a baseline incentive for game developers. As you content creator might use you in more benchmark videos because you're the first game that has ray tracing, or you're the first game on PS5 Pro, even if it doesn't have a lot of sales.
I remember for a while, Hardware Unboxed called Shadow, what is it? Something of the Singularity, Ashes of the Singularity, called it Ashes of the Benchmark, because there's like one of those first games to use a new engine, and so it was just in every average for GPU reviews.
Yeah, so ignoring that baseline incentive, it needs to push enough units where your customers are coming in and saying, hey, I have a Battlemage, I need this thing, right? And typically with the whole 73% NVIDIA thing, that's pretty hard. If I could see it going to like 60% NVIDIA or 50% NVIDIA, that would definitely open the option up. But
to more aggressively support.
But if
AMD
you need to pick like 2 vendors, it's just AMD and NVIDIA, and you just don't have to bother with the 0.01% unless you really care about your player base, right? And you're not doing it for the numbers, you're doing it for your game's going to be better thing premise.
Yes, but so it sounds like you do think that is something people should be concerned about. Like I would suggest maybe you're painting a picture where it's like, look, Battlemage was supported on most games when it came out. It seems like they probably worked, overtime for a couple months to make sure this launch went smoother than the previous one. But 1 month out, they're still not replying to any devs about XE super sampling too. And so there is a real concern. Can they keep up that driver support for more than like 1 month? Like, I mean, like you just tested Dishonored, didn't work. Your game had like multiple games are coming out already that seem to have issues.
So yeah, the question when buying a GPU, people should be asking, and reviewers should be asking, is can this GPU vendor make a commitment? You're going to get 8 years of updates, or you're going to get 10 years of updates, or you're going to get 5 years of day one game support. Because it seems like the reviewers say, hey, buy this GPU, maybe you'll keep it for a couple of years, maybe we'll support it, but there's technically no commitment from any of the vendors saying this is going to be a 5-year thing. When you buy an Android phone, they say you're going to get major Android updates for 3 years, and this is the last version of Android I'm going to get. But for Battlemage, it could be 10 years, it could be 2 years, the driver team could get laid off next week. It could be supported, but technically like a skeleton crew that's not really making it work.
I would suggest that's probably what it would happen. I don't think they completely drop it.
Is a new game that comes out a year from now going to run on your B580 card if they've given up on some of the support and they're focusing on the next card, right? That's the unknown, and I'd much rather if people hold GPU vendors accountable and say, NVIDIA, you need to guarantee me X number of years of updates as a written public commitment. And if you don't do that, I'm going to get a refund. Right? Like that needs to be the standard, but it just seems like reviewers are not pushing for that or not really a big factor. But from the game dev side, Intel shipped a broken driver update for their iGPUs and then abandoned support for it. So the very latest driver is broken.
No.
And
for the one you mentioned, yeah.
Yeah, they do this thing that's like, oh, it's only going to get security fixes. Great, right? How's my games going to run on it? And so as a game developer, we have to do all these checks in the code that's like, if Battlemage this, do this fix. Else, if this GPU, do this fix. And it's not very fun. And sometimes these bug fixes are just so complicated that it's just a house of cards and falls apart. And we just kind of just put a message that says, hey, if you have this GPU, we're just not bothering to support you anymore. And
I'm looking at this. Oh, wow. I forgot what 10th gen even was because I'm looking at the driver support ending. That includes Ice Lake. Ice Lake had a good integrated graphics. I remember actually being very impressed with Intel Ice Lake and thinking you really didn't need a dedicated graphics card. I think it was like around as strong as an MX 250 or somewhere around there. Like, that was decent. That's an interesting blunder, I would say, by them, because whenever you look at the Steam hardware surveys, I mean, you have to admit, Intel graphics is actually huge if you count integrated. And if you signal to developers, by the way, after 2 years or whatever, like, we might just crush. And again, when you say 2 years, it's like, oh yeah, end of life products. Yeah, so they ended that life in 2022. I'm sorry, I'm just reading this too. I'm talking to you. Right. Yeah. And so
if
they
you
were
look at
selling
the release date for that CPU, 10th gen or 11th gen.
Yeah, it's not like all of these had their driver support ended after 2 years, but there were models that came out and 2 years later they got rid of driver support. Like, if you're a developer, you're like, well, I've been putting all of this effort into just white knuckling it, making it barely so my game runs in 720p 30 frames per second, because I know there are people that don't have expensive systems and I want them to be able to play, whatever the game is. And then if you're like, well, it doesn't matter, you put in all that effort optimizing for this weak iGPU. Like, yeah, that's a weird thing to signal to developers, because I would argue Intel's integrated graphics market share is probably the biggest reason you see Battlemage.
It's more important than Battlemage even, right? And they could be taking valuable lessons from still maintaining that driver and rolling it into Battlemage, but because they've abandoned it, they could have used a shared code base where they're like, okay, even though it's old, we're still going to learn the lessons from Battlemage and apply it to this. But they're not even bothering to do that. And I consider that, mistreatment of the customers that bought your processor, right? And not all these processors, some of these processors are in laptops. And you can't, not like you can plug a GPU in that's upgradable. You're screwed. You got to buy a new laptop, and your laptop might be fine. Sucks.
All right, let me see here. This is a random one, but I want to ask you about it. Clean Sweep writes in, why do you think Sony would design PSSR to use XeSS code and functionality as shown here? So he linked to a video. It is a timestamp. I clicked on it. It's pretty quick. This seems to be a video about something else where someone just stumbled into seeing XeSS code in a PSSR log or something. Maybe you have nothing to say, but I included
you
that.
could probably have the editor put this on screen. It does look like they're using the exact same variable names, right? Like I said, PSSR and XeSS both use enabled optimal screen percentage and quality as exact values, and they're pretty much all identical. They even call quality ultra quality plus. So PSSR has ultra quality plus, and XeSS also has ultra quality plus. That could be weird. They could have looked at the XeSS plugin as a reference, even for like, how do we make an Unreal Engine plugin that does upscaling, and just swapped all the calls out to be PSSR.
Because XE super sampling is open source, right?
Yeah, you can just download it off GitHub and look at the code. So that's probably my guess. Otherwise, there might be a naming convention on Unreal. But developers will do this. Like if you're making an Unreal Engine plugin, you're Sony, you might have never made Unreal plugin before. So you're looking at examples. For sure.
You're looking at FSR, you're looking at XE super sampling, and you're like, this seems to work. I
wish these were more unified. Something else I wanted to mention was when adding FSR support, NVIDIA and these vendors use different naming for everything, and they have different setting names, and it's kind of a mess for the UI, right? I guess NVIDIA had this idea where developers in their game would have an NVIDIA tab, and it would just have NVIDIA DLSS, NVIDIA Reflex, NVIDIA this, NVIDIA that. For a game developer, we don't want that. We just want a tab that's like enable upscaling, and it just does whatever the vendor specific thing is. So there's definitely some, on the like UI side.
They're organizing it from an NVIDIA-centric mindset where they're like, here's all the NVIDIA stuff. You're saying, don't do that. Put your NVIDIA stuff where it's already supposed to go. Right.
Yeah, like instead of like I got guidelines from DLSS for NVIDIA, and they start stuff like make an NVIDIA tab, and they're kind of using the NVIDIA settings as like a marketing thing, as in like your game is marketing, go buy an NVIDIA GPU because there's so many NVIDIA settings into it.
They want that in the game settings. So when you have like video, display, audio, NVIDIA settings, I think I have seen that in a game or two.
Yes, right. So when we're adding this settings in, we had an NVIDIA settings panel, and we're like, hang on, are we just marketing NVIDIA's GPUs in our game as like an ad? Like, could we just call this upscaling or whatever? And is NVIDIA going to get upset at us if we don't market, if we just call it, like you can use the word, hey, DLSS or upscaling, but you can use a generic term for it and not the NVIDIA specific term, right?
And that's confused me before, because I've been like, where this game says it has DLSS support. Where is it?
So if you have a drop down, right? Like DLSS is calling it ultra performance balanced, and ultra performance is a completely different setting on FSR, and they might call it a different name. But if you go over to PSSR, that's kind of confusing for developers. We want unification. We want to have low, medium, high upscaling as a setting that works on every GPU that is standardized, and we're not advertising some GPU. Like me putting AXX2 in my game might be advertising Battlemage more than Intel's marketing team is, right? Like this channel, Morsel is Dead, has more subscribers than Intel's own gaming channel, right? So they're like not putting a lot of effort in to their own marketing for gaming.
Well, so it's funny. So it sounds like you want, like, cut the bullshit, AMD, NVIDIA, just whatever NVIDIA is calling it, which I believe is like quality, balanced, performance. Can we all just call the upscaling that? Can you please just call yours that, so we know what you're targeting when you do that? That's what you're saying too.
Yeah, just unify everything. And if you want mass game support, make it easy to add and unify everything as much as possible. Like everyone calling like resizable bars called SAM on AMD for some reason, just to confuse everyone. I don't know if it's worth it, right? Like,
Well, technically they said it first, so that is where you think. But
There
I guess
should be a
Intel
standard
can.
of just call it the same thing so we know what it is and it's unified. I don't want to add 3 different UI menus per GPU. It's kind of a mess.
Well, speaking of copying what your competition calls their stuff, let's talk about the 9070 XT. We have to talk about RDNA 4. It was not in the press conference. They put out a separate press release. I suppose from that perspective, we should mention that we both agree that's their excuses are very, very silly. I'll even just say, I am like 99% sure that AMD just decided last minute we shouldn't announce RDNA 4 fully until we fully understand what we're competing with. Let's delay it a week. And actually, on that note, I was actually messaged today by a contact that was just briefed by AMD representatives. This contact said that they should unveil RDNA 4 fully, or at least close to fully, just like a week from now. I think I was told January 15th. So I'll have that quote put on screen too. So that's interesting. It still sounds like it might launch in January or something. It really doesn't sound like something went wrong so much as AMD didn't know if they're ready to talk about RDNA 4 until they fully understood the competition. That is really what I believe happened with it being cut there. But I don't know. What do you think about AMD saying they only had 45 minutes?
The narrative thing, like I watched the Hardware Unboxed video and they said, oh, CES has got a 45-minute timer. Like, it's busy. We can't.
NVIDIA's wasn't.
The interesting thing about AMD's keynote was how many vendors they had there promising they're going to ship AMD CPUs. Like they spent time on Dell and Xbox and all
to
this
be
stuff.
fair, I think Dell's a big deal for AMD for investor reasons. I would agree. The Xbox thing, I think we were talking about that, is complete nonsense. I mean, unless Xbox announced a next-gen console that uses RDNA 4. I don't know, maybe their handheld that's rumored will use RDNA 4. Maybe that's why they were there. But they should have announced it if they did. Why wouldn't you bring up PlayStation, who's using some of the architectural features of RDNA 4? I think like the BVH traversal thing for ray tracing from it and the PS5 Pro, that would make more sense because they're actually using it. Point being, if they had to cut some time, maybe the Xbox part, and you can just put that out on your channel separately. I don't know.
I think the Xbox thing was like Xbox is a publisher even, which is super weird because like Xbox is a PC games publisher, which we're not really used to that much. And like they're going to add FSR 4, but we never got told what FSR 4 was. I guess they told the press before the keynote.
Yeah.
But it's definitely a bit of a mess of for an event like this, you'd plan for weeks, right? Like,
yeah,
just randomly cutting it off or moving something off because of some 45-minute thing, I think is crazy. But if the 45-minute thing is true, why didn't AMD pay more money to CES to get a bigger slot at a different spot or a different stage or whatever the hell they needed to do? Like, it's kind of like depending on how much money or how big your company is, you get a bigger slot kind of vibe going on.
Mm-hmm.
And I think AMD could have just got a bigger slot or something, or put their keynote after NVIDIA or something like that. But at least, or just be upfront and say, hey, we're going to launch this thing, a week from now, or say something like that doesn't imply this weird shutdown, cancel kind of thing vibe going on.
Well, or, half of the time you spent dunking on Arrow Lake, remove that. Half of the time you spent talking about Kraken, remove that. We know, just show us what it is and then move on. Like, there's so many things. Cut the Xbox thing in half. There's so many things that they could have cut down that I saw a joke that was like the audio issues in the beginning of it is why we didn't get the RDNA 4 announcement. But
It could.
I don't think so. I don't believe any of that. I think, I don't know who came up with that excuse. It's a ridiculous excuse. Again, I think they were afraid to announce pricing before NVIDIA. They caught wind of how insane NVIDIA's presentation is going to be. I might also say, from a more pessimistic point of view, maybe AMD saw the generated frame stuff and said, we need our charts to have more fake frames on them. They may have said, we need to go away and do that. I don't know. And by the way, I also think then NVIDIA went, oh, so AMD's not announcing pricing? Fine, we'll just go to our minimum price we're willing to do for these cards and see how AMD likes making us go first. That is really what I think.
They could have mentioned the cards without pricing, or
they could have teased a new event. Like, if it's happening in a week from now, just tell us the event's in a week.
The vibe I get is like, we don't care about our GPUs that much. right? 'Cause, like, compared to
Yes.
CPUs, and that's not, if you want to grow the GPU market, you need to show you care about the GPUs. Like, announce it without pricing, because like Power Color did this tweet where they're like, "Hey guys, we're at CES2, we're gonna have GPUs or whatever," but they weren't even in the keynote, right? You think, man, I feel bad for this OEM that came to CES for the whole point of their GPUs being announced to show them off. And they're like, "Hey, we're here too," and it got cut. So like, I almost feel bad for the OEM partners more than AMD
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure AMD's doing at least as much, if not significantly more oppo research than I'm doing for my YouTube channel. So I assume they expected the 5070, to be a certain price. They expected DLSS 4 to be interesting, but they didn't know NVIDIA is going to claim AI face stuff and all this crazy things. And I think they said, well, we can't completely remove a press announcement because we literally have AIBs at the show floor showing off 16 gigabyte cards. So, like, what's the minimum we can show without showing anything so that it doesn't look completely ridiculous? There's AIBs there.
It just seemed to me like organized chaos, because we had Nvidia, for example, there was a press release from, was it Razer and MSI, about new laptops with 50 series GPUs, when the 50 series GPUs hasn't been announced yet. Like, it just seems like that's a weird kind of chaotic launch where we're finding out random bits of info from random people.
And maybe that's intentional, though. Maybe NVIDIA's like, tease the 5090 before we announce it.
It could be nice just to see, like, the first piece. Like, people have this first information bias where the first thing they hear is treated more seriously. So I wonder if kind of doing this bait and switch hype thing is more dangerous to the brand than just announcing it without pricing, compared to making it disappear.
Yeah, I actually, we'll see if I'm wrong. My suspicion is it doesn't matter, actually, that like no one's talking about the Intel ring bus flaw anymore, even though the CPUs are still breaking. My suspicion is that no one will even remember this happened a month from now. That we'll know what the pricing is. It'll have launched or be about to launch. We'll know how it stacks up. It'll be like, it's a little better than the 5070, but it doesn't have DLSS, but it's a little cheaper with more RAM, is what I'm guessing. And no, and that's what I think AMD's calculating.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's weird to have them say we're going to make the naming convention less confusing and copy NVIDIA. And I guess you can put the slide up or whatever. But the other part was they made their CPU naming convention worse by calling everything Pro Max Plus. So I'm getting this signal where they're like, we care about the naming so much, guys. We've changed our entire naming convention, seemingly every other card, but we've made the CPU naming more complex. And I wonder if AMD having confidence in their own product and just staying with the course is stronger for the GPU brand instead of swapping out the naming convention. Like, could you imagine if NVIDIA just changed their naming convention
every other gen
just to mess with AMD? Whatever. Like, it just seems like if you want to build an audience of people that buy AMD GPUs every generation, make it consistent and make it like stick it out, even if it's uncomfortable, to build the brand slowly over time.
No, but yeah, your point about the CPU versus GPU naming is interesting because, going from what 7700 XT to 9070 XT, I know what that means. I think most enthusiasts will instantly know what they're referencing, and who cares? But if you're going to do that to try to sound like, why is the CPU then? I'm looking at it now. AMD Ryzen AI Max Plus 395. Like, you have not made this, so like, but they're different marketing teams, and this proves it. Like, you have on the one side, they're like 9070 XT, 9070, 9060 XT, 9060, 9050 XT, and we're done. We're going home. And over here, we have the AI Max 365 plus triple X. I mean, I don't know. There's a lot of inconsistency here with AMD and marketing, and I don't know. It still just doesn't, to me, feel like they're getting it together like they were telling me they might.
It's kind of baffling from the consumer standpoint of seeing like how hard is it to get the naming consistent. You know what I mean? Like, it doesn't.
And they went to 9,000, so presumably they're going to have to start over again with UDNA or something, and unless they go to 10,000, which maybe they will.
Everything
I don't
needs
know.
to have Pro Max Plus in it. So I think at this point I've got to declare it as being done intentionally to confuse consumers, right? Like we want to put Zen 3 and Zen 4 CPUs out there. They can't have the old name because no one will realize they're old and buy them. We need to rebrand them and keep reselling them. And Intel does the same thing, where if you bought a 14th gen, it might not be Raptor Lake, it might be the one before. And so it's just swap the naming every gen to confuse consumers so they don't know what they're buying, and it's not good. Like the Pro Max thing stuff, I kind of see vaguely of like Apple's doing it, so maybe it's like working or whatever.
I can get it to a certain degree, yes, but then why do you have AI HX? Like, it's like you wanted to use both names at the same time.
Yeah, so we have this challenge in our game where we hire someone and say, hey, repeat all the names of the dinosaurs in our game backwards or up by heart or whatever, right? But just imagine going to an AMD employee and say, can you just list off like the different types of CPUs and what they're named for the last couple of gens? They would totally fail.
Whereas if you go to NVIDIA, easiest thing to do in the
you
world.
Could count it super easy. Yeah, that makes sense.
This piece of content is brought to you by the Minis Forum V3. The Minis Forum V3 is a reasonably priced alternative to a sort of form factor that usually costs twice as much. And yet, despite costing under $1,000, it comes with a lot of unique features. It can work as its own independent display to be used with game consoles or really another PC if you want to use it for that. And that display also is high refresh rate and is 1600 The thing has hawk point. I mean, I actually did a full review for this. It works fantastically. Can play any AAA game that I own. And then, when it comes to battery life, it's, a bit middle of the road. But the fact is, it can use just about anything to charge. A lot of laptops that I've come across require, 45 watt minimum power sources to charge. This thing's minimum is 15 watts. You can plug it into a random port at the airport and just keep on gaming or keep working. And I have been using it diligently throughout 2024 as I've flown a lot, and it actually fits on the plane, can keep going forever with battery packs, and I've gotten a lot of work done on the go. And then when I get back to the hotel room, I start to play because, again, it has gaming chops. So if you're interested in this product, go to the link in the description and use offer code BrokenSilicon to save $30 on this fantastic laptop tablet display hybrid device. If you use Broken Silicon, you'll be helping the channel. Even just clicking on the link helps as well. So support Moore's Law is Dead by checking out the Minis Forum V3 today. B Jones 1794 writes in and says, I'm incredibly annoyed at AMD literally not even trying in their CES keynote by not announcing GPUs or pricing or even bringing out Lisa Su. It felt like they just gave up before they started. But if the 9070 XT really is not 7900 XT-ish performance, which I know they didn't announce performance, but they did show a chart comparing, the 9070 XT to the 7900 XT directly. It says, do you think that performance at a $400, $450, or maybe $500 price point is realistic? And could it possibly stand a chance against the 5070 once drivers are finalized and reviewers actually benchmark results and compare the two? Well, I'll jump in first and say this absolutely could cost $500 or less. I think they could get away with $400 if they wanted to accept fairly low margins, because the 7800 XT was $500. It used basically the same node for most of the die, 200 millimeters squared, and then it had four 36 millimeter squared 6 nanometer dies, and then so you have a total die size, right, of 330 or 50 or something, and then those were all had to be packaged and put together, and that cost money. RDNA 4, my understanding, is a 250 to 350 millimeter squared, probably not even 350, 250 to 300 millimeter squared total monolithic 4 nanometer. I think it costs less to make than the 7800 XT probably. So I think there's no doubt in my mind that $499 they can do if they want to. And I could see cheaper.
Yeah, I think I'm a little bit concerned about the keynote retraction kind of showing their hand a little bit here on the performance.
Were they about to announce something stupid?
I also wonder if the AMD GPU traditional raster performance is better, I would come out and say, hey, these are real frames and we're rendering them this much faster at this percentage. If they can catch NVIDIA in the, by the way, our raster performance isn't actually that faster from last gen, they could have a angle there from the media standpoint, but if people really buy this fake frame stuff and stuff like that, that they might be in serious trouble. It's even if the card is a lot faster, is their features going to be better than DLSS and some of the other stuff where it's at now? And that's the real, the real question.
So I just now in my head started putting myself in AMD's shoes, and hear me out, everybody. I can now actually kind of see why they don't know what to do, because we know Blackwell's launching in 3 weeks or something. And I know that in real performance, the 5070 is probably a little stronger than a 4070 Ti. Seems like the 5090 will be 35 to 50 something percent faster. We'll see. I mean, they only showed a couple of games that they hand selected faster than the 4090 and so on and so forth. But that's not what NVIDIA portrayed. And so you've got this situation where if you're AMD and NVIDIA was honest about real world performance outside of using fake frames, then you could just go, oh, well, we're going to compare the 9070 XT to the 4080 or the 4070 Ti Super, because we know that NVIDIA admitted the 5070 is around that performance. But they haven't. NVIDIA claimed the 5070 is as strong as a 4090, even though it isn't. And we're not going to have real benchmarks of it for 3 weeks. So what do you announce if you're AMD? Do you announce let's say it's even better than the 7900 XT, all right? But I think it'll be around there. Like, even if it was XTX performance, what do you do? Say better than the 4080? Because then all the press is going to go, but that doesn't matter. The 5070 is stronger than the 4090. So actually, now that I'm thinking about this, I suspect that's what AMD took a week to figure out, is how do we portray this performance? Because wow, are they going crazy with the fake frames and the crazy claims that they're making? We've got to figure out a strategy and how to accurately portray the value we think we're bringing without people just being misled or something.
Also, if they want to go the angle of, well, fake frames are bad, if they added fake frames in their FSR4, they can't exactly go and say, hey, fake frames are bad, but we added them in FSR4. They're kind of stuck in this trap of seeing if NVIDIA's is there a gap between raster performance versus fake frames and upscaling, and they might be really hard stuck on waiting until, because how do you even market this thing, right? FSR is 4 great. Let's say they added 3 generated frames instead of 4, or 2 instead of 3. They're going to be behind on the numbers so badly, and if reviewers if they plainly trust the FPS number, which has been done for the last 10 years, people just go based on the FPS number. On the paper, they might be screwed, but the card might actually be not bad if it is properly marketed and properly explained. But they're kind of caught in this thing of, we might be doing frame generation, but NVIDIA is doing more frame generation. How do people compare this traditionally? And that's going to be where it's stuck. Until that 5090 performance of the 5070 or whatever, or 4090 performance of the 5070, until that gets debunked, how are you supposed to announce, unless you release charts or whatever, but your charts are going to be comparing last gen because you don't have access to the next gen. So you're stuck with
charts. And NVIDIA's acting like even the 5060, though that's not announced, is somehow faster than a 4090. You can't compare it to last gen. Honestly, I'm starting to realize maybe that, as dishonest as it is, maybe that was a brilliant move by NVIDIA to just be like, you know what? Now you can't even compare our cards. No one will believe you.
So they can't, AMD can't come out and say, hey, this is so much better than a 4090 if a lower card is faster than a 4090. So they have to prove the lie, and it's like NVIDIA handpicked the best charts to put them in the worst position. Either the charts didn't make NVIDIA look good, or they intentionally were careful to avoid the AMD comparison. So it's kind of hard to market a card like that if you're in this trap, like a perfectly constructed trap.
And now I think that's why AMD delayed their announcement. And here's what I worry. I really worry. And again, I don't know how good FSR4 is. I honestly know, or at a minimum, I haven't asked anyone or read anything about it for many months. But let's say AMD was going to add fake frames, and let's say they were going to have, like you said, 3 times instead of 4 times. Is AMD now going back and they're like, just add a stupid mode that's 6 frames? Even if it's horrible, add the 6 frame mode. And I'm just worried they're going to do that. come back in a week and go, oh, well, we have 6 times the frames and it's actually 50% faster than a 7900 XTX if you use this crazy mode. That is what I suspect they're going to do, because that's the only way I see out of this trap, is to fight fire with fire.
And if they don't have the Reflex 2 or whatever attack that's supposed to counter the latency problem, they could have some fake frames, and they picked a less number of fake frames to go with because they don't have a fix for the latency. And that, not to mention the whole neural shader thing. We really don't know if they have an answer for that. Like, they might be,
or if they need to, does it even work? Like, NVIDIA, when they announced because I want to remind people of this, when NVIDIA announced the 4060 Ti 8GB, they said because it has GDDR6 or something, 8GB was enough. Well, it wasn't. It didn't, and then they just didn't even respond to an email after that.
Yeah, so it's very well on the tech side, it's problematic. So major respect to the AMD team, engineers working late in the night trying to figure out how the hell we even announced this thing, and I hope for the best for them, because they'll need it for sure.
Yeah, again, just for everyone listening, as dumb as I think it is what AMD did, and there's no defense of the 45-minute excuse. I mean, it's just stupid. But I now get why they probably delayed it a week, because do we show more fake frames? Do we not show more fake frames? Do we announce that we're also making some competitor to neural compression, even though we don't even know if their thing will work? DLSS 1 didn't work. How do we know that will work? Like, yeah, they're in an odd position. And if I were at AMD, I would say, add more fake frames to the graph. We'll have 2 charts, 2 different slides. The first slide will be, the real comparison, but we'll have the dumb thing so we can compare it to NVIDIA and say faster than 4090. Like, I guess we have to pretend just like NVIDIA is. I really think that's their only option. I think I'll skip over some of the ray tracing talk. I'll bring it up very quickly, though. Like, there's questions, we get these all the time when there's a developer on, about how important is ray tracing in deciding what card you buy. At this point, it seems like the opinion of me and Dan, co-host of the news episodes of Broken Silicon, has pretty much been, frankly, above a 6900 XT. Raster is kind of solved for a lot of resolutions, like to a ridiculous degree. And after that, ray tracing becomes more important. Like, especially once you're getting above like the 4070, because I'm not really sure that raster is what's holding you back half the time. I know there's people who will say, I don't use DLSS or FSR and I like to turn on super sampling. It's like, well, I'm not talking to you. But like, how important is the ray tracing performance, in your opinion, in 2025 compared to raster? Like, I don't even know how to quantify it. Like, let's say 2 cards are equal raster. How big of a deal would it be if the other one had double the ray tracing performance, or even just 20% more?
So for my game specifically, that's a non-ray trace game at the moment, I'm kind of on the fence. We did try to do ray tracing at one point. I would much prefer take 10% raster performance, whatever. Like, we can render more models, we could have higher LUTs, we can have greater draw distance, but the ray tracing thing has a lot of problems. Like the house of cards I was talking about earlier, where you do the ray tracing, now you're at half the resolution, now you need reflex, now you need neural materials, and then you need DLSS, and that house of cards, especially with TSR or TAA, feels like a huge risk. Like, if people don't care about image quality and ray tracing looks cool, sure, buy a ray tracing card, right? But if you one of those types that really cares about image quality or has a workload, like, how many games still support ray tracing? If you're going off your Steam library, the numbers might be still pretty rough, but you have to like ray tracing, prefer to play during ray tracing, is kind of the hard part, right? And I wonder if developers will kind of be more lazy about how hard they work on the non-ray trace version, because the ray tracing just if they tried really hard, they could get a really close image that's fake, that doesn't do any ray tracing. But are they going to stop trying, right? Like, if they stop trying, because most people have ray tracing now, you're going to see a faster shift.
Right? Like, the best looking games that I've played, I would say, are The Last of Us Part 2 and like Demon's Souls, so they don't use ray tracing. Granted, The Last of Us is a huge studio. They can afford to pre-bake so many things and like just little adjustments to the graphics in every scene. But it is worth pointing that. And yeah, just looking at my Steam library, Age of Empires doesn't use ray tracing. Battlefield 2042 does. Deep Rock Galactic, nope. Like, it still seems to me like only a third of the games I regularly play have ray tracing.
So not only do they need to support ray tracing, now they need DLSS 4 or whatever tech you've got. So there might be ray tracing, but DLSS 2 or an older version. And now, the requirements are rapidly growing for how to get a noise-free ray traced image, and that's going to be the question. So yeah, like I said, it's a personal preference, but for at least on the Unreal Engine side, we still don't have wind on trees and ray tracing. Ray tracing is technically not in real time, right? Like, it's the biggest myth of ray tracing I've ever seen. They say, hey, it's technically more real time than pre-baking it. But when I think of real time, I think next frame it's updated. You can have a tree that moves, that shadow is 7 seconds behind where it's supposed to be, because we can't ray trace fast enough to update everything completely in sync. Right? And this is why you see the high input latency, is because it takes so long to render a frame now because of the ray tracing. And I think that's kind of the concern.
Quick Jumper writes in, he says, NVIDIA and AMD have taken fundamentally different philosophical approaches to ray tracing optimization through software. NVIDIA focuses on maximizing raw ray tracing performance by fine-tuning the interaction between their dedicated RT cores and the rest of the GPU pipeline, optimizing areas like shader execution reordering and denoising to push the boundaries of what's possible with their specialized hardware. On the other hand, AMD has concentrated on making ray tracing more efficient and integrated within their existing compute architecture, working to reduce the resource overhead through optimized BVH traversal and better memory management, essentially trying to make ray tracing a more natural extension of their general purpose computing approach rather than a separate specialized workload. Considering the different approaches to ray tracing optimization by AMD and NVIDIA, which architectural strategy is proving more future-proof in your opinion? NVIDIA's dedicated hardware acceleration focused on maximizing performance, or AMD's integrated approach that prioritizes efficiency and resource optimization?
Yeah, so for this one, I definitely have a preference for AMD's integrated approach, because if we can render the ray tracing faster and more efficient, we're not going to need to do so much upscaling, and we're not going to need to do so much frame generation and that kind of thing. And I think we'll have a better quality image sooner. But NVIDIA approach seems to be, hey, let's make this as noisy as possible, and we're going to machine learn the noise out of it. And I just don't buy the machine learning being good enough for solving the problem on mass games. Like, NVIDIA's example of games that have solved this problem are kind of cherry picked, right? Like, are they really going to train an AI model with, like, a lot of compute hours for a single game, for every single game, to make it be as noise free as possible? Like, I don't think that's realistic. I think with DLSS, we're getting a generalized model used across a bunch of games, and it's not going to be as good as pulling out the noise and problems out of specific games. And like, using a game like Cyberpunk, you could spend a year training a model just for Cyberpunk if you want to, right? There's like just this game in this area. But I think AMD's solution of optimizing it more and relying on it being more efficient is probably better for the long term, even if it's not as good right now, is what my take would be.
Yeah. And I think this is something that came up, I think, with a podcast. I think it was actually maybe even a Die Shrink with Carbon Cry, who's a contributor at Moore's Law is Dead. It handles the notes for stuff. And also, I believe it came up in a Broken Silicon with Brian Heemskirk, who's another developer. But I think there's a big misunderstanding with ray tracing performance with NVIDIA versus AMD in terms of capabilities. It's not that AMD couldn't try to keep up with or match NVIDIA's ray tracing performance every gen. It's that they have chosen to make smaller dies that aim for going for maximum efficiency over bolting on a bunch of silicon. And if you ask me, that's a very APU-centric approach to ray tracing, like making sure we can have ray tracing that works on a Steam Deck. You're not seeing that out of NVIDIA. NVIDIA gave up on making MX graphics cards after Turing, actually. And so I just think it's a very different approach. And were AMD to ever try to bolt on more, which I guess they are with RDNA 4, at least they're starting from an efficient base, right, with traversal, is how I would put it. And we'll see how that pans out with RDNA 4.
And PS6 and stuff like that, if they end up using an AMD processor,
if
like, Probably, right? So like they're gonna want to have the ray tracing that works well on an EPU. So like that's like Nvidia, by not being a Xbox, PlayStation kind of device, it's going to be a better bet to bet on that kind of ray tracing. And even on the Switch, are we going to imagine a Switch that has ray tracing at one point? Like, is that going to be a thing? Is
Yes.
Nvidia's solution going to scale down to Switch? Maybe
I've heard mixed
DLSS,
things
but
about that. Let's move on to that, actually, the Switch 2, because that was one of the things to bring up soon. So, yeah, I mean, the specs, I believe, have been known forever. God, I think a year now I put out, like, it's like 1536 CUDA cores, boosts really high in docked mode, might boost below 800 megahertz, maybe quite a bit lower than that in handheld mode, but it'll be at a lower resolution, so I don't care. 4K output with an aggressive DLSS. Although I know Digital Foundry did some test where they're like, I don't even know if this graphics card is powerful enough to power DLSS. But then I think there's some suggestion that this is a hand-tailored DLSS for the Switch 2, possibly with an extra IP block in there that helps some of the workload. I've always heard DLSS is a major component of the Switch 2, so I have to imagine they wouldn't do it unless it worked somehow. So yes, it will. But I imagine some games like Mario will have some light ray tracing or something. But what do you think about that? And like Lucas writes in and says, what is the sentiment for the Switch 2? It has more RAM than the Series S, but not a ton more. Is it enough, and will it be enough for 8 years? The OG Switch got very ambitious ports because of the large install base. Switch 2 will not have that to rely on, at least not to begin with.
So Switch 1 has lived a very long life. So, and with really bad specs. So I feel like even if they only have that much RAM, they might better get away with it. But developers are very upset about the Series S already. They're like, I hate how little RAM it has. So 8 years from now for the Switch 2, kind of going to be also really, especially if Steam OS is going to be doing this handheld thing and there's going to be new handhelds coming out every other year. It definitely seems a little long in the tooth for that, but knowing Nintendo's strategy where they don't care about having the highest specs, it's probably going to be fine for them. The bit that I'm going to hate supporting is going to be the Switch 1 after the Switch 2 is out. Right? Because there's like Switch 2, sure. I mean, hopefully it doesn't have the same broken like Nintendo policies that restrict developers on stuff. That's going to suck, but are people gonna stop releasing new games for Switch 1, right? Are they still gonna, like, 9 years from now, we're still gonna be seeing Switch 1 games because so many people have the Switch 1? Like, that's gonna be the most interesting question I see. I'm excited for it, but I'm not like, hey, my next game's gonna be on Switch 2 because I don't want to deal with the procedures from Nintendo that make the Switch difficult. That's not hardware. That's the biggest thing to me. Like, if I want to put a patch out on Switch, I can patch every platform and console within a day, but Switch is this painful 30-day process, right? And I'd much rather, it has to sell a lot of units for me to be willing to put up with Nintendo on the Switch too. Like, I love Nintendo, they're great, but the policies, we just don't agree, and it's very, very painful as a developer. Like, if Sony does a handheld or Xbox does a handheld,
which they both seem to be,
like, the Nintendo brand and Mario is going to be carrying the Switch mostly. That's the main problem.
Yeah.
Like, what the specs are doesn't matter. It runs Mario, right? But the developer experience is probably going to be a lot better on another platform that's not so restrictive. Our game's one of the few games on Switch that has full modding support. And it was painful to get that to work.
Wow.
You know what I mean? Like, the vibes were like, hey, if your game writes too much, it's going to destroy our, chip, right? Like,
because they use really cheap memory in their game cartridges, right?
Our flash storage chip is going to die if you write a gigabyte to it or something like that, right? Like, that was the vibe. And I'm like, people download games that are 32 gigabytes on this thing all the time, but I can't write so much gigabytes of this thing. That's the frustrating thing as a developer, is the restrictions that aren't hardware that are in software. So I feel like that's going to be the most annoying thing. But regarding the announcement, I'm kind of sick of waiting for it at this point. Like, let's get it announced.
Yeah. I have to assume they just knew they had one more holiday season of a ton of new Switch One games, and they're like, we want to sell off the rest of the Switch One, because I think the Switch Two is going to be. We've already seen pictures of it leak. Like, it's going to be a very like linear transition into like, this is just the better one, it's the same thing, right? And they know once that's out, they should probably have the Switch gone. So I assume that's what it is. And it's funny too, because there's been some debate online if like the SoC leak is, because I know it was originally 8 nanometer. There's people debating if they die shrunk it to 5 nanometer. I have to be honest, when I saw it, I'm like, that doesn't seem too small to be 8 nanometer. And Digital Foundry seems to also think it's 8 nanometer. So that would kill the one thing where I was like, oh, maybe they waited to die shrink it. Nope, it's still 8 nanometer, but we'll see. But yeah, anyways, yeah, I'm rambling. But yeah, that's what I think's going on. I wonder what the performance, though. I actually think 12 gigabytes might be enough. And hear me out. I think the big problem with the Xbox Series S having 10 gigabytes is two things. Number one, it's segmented memory in a really silly way. That's actually different than the Series S. And number two, it's trying to be this that's segmented different than the Series X. So you have to have two different memory pools that are two different sizes for two consoles, I believe, which is hard and annoying. But then also, I think the problem is the Series S is trying to be the Series X, and the Switch 2 isn't trying to be a PS5 or something. And so with 12 gigabytes, knowing that from the get-go, you're just going to use the smallest textures, do you disagree that might make it easier to support long-term with 12 gigabytes? Whereas developers are told, here's a 4 teraflop console with split 10 gigabytes of memory. Make a game that's also on the PS5 work. And I think that's just very hard to do.
Yeah, I have customers that come in for a game and they say, hey, I have a Series S. Why does your game not look as good? You know, like why does this game look worse than a PS4 or PS? Like, I went and looked up the math, and PS4 Pro is like technically faster than Series X in some ways.
Much better bandwidth, unified memory. The RAM mount in total that's usable by the developer isn't shockingly different, actually, because they have another gigabyte of RAM on there for offloading some of the tasks. So it's like 9 gigabytes versus 10 on the Series S. And Windows isn't the most efficient operating system, so it's probably a similar amount of usable memory for the developer. So that's true. But then also, I mean, look, the bandwidth difference is like 2-3 times. It's like a stupid amount more bandwidth. And I mean, we're talking about, I forgot what it was. Like, I think it's like 16 ROPs, for example, in the Series S. There's 64 in the PS4 Pro. So there are some parts of the specs outside of teraflops that are like wildly higher on the PS4 Pro.
Yeah, when I was checking Microsoft's own site for it, it's just like a huge difference in teraflops performance, and having a feel of, hey, I have a brand new next gen console and it's lower than the PS4 Pro in some ways, is not a feel good, right? Mm-hmm. And that's kind of it's you know, just because it has an SSD and just because it has some of the other stuff doesn't fix some of the performance problems with it. And you know, there's things I could do to optimize a game, but I'm cutting the game down a lot. And like, people will try to use this thing on a 4K TV and be like, why does it look so bad? And it's like the marketing isn't super clear about, you know, the way it's cut down for the resolution is just not really a good split. And I think they would have been better to, you know, sell a disk driveless version that was more expensive, or some kind of solution that didn't involve this, or let developers just release games for the Series X or something. But
they can't. 80% of the sales are Series S. So yeah, my opinion's always been, look, if they wanted to do it, and let's be honest, the point of the Series S isn't to make money on the console. It's to get people to have Game Pass at a cheap price. Like, they should have had the no split memory, 320-bit bus is what's in the Series X. They should have given that 20 gigabytes. They should have given the Series S 16 gigabytes and eaten the extra $20 in RAM. Like, I mean, that's my answer. But would you agree with this argument then that potentially, though, right? Like, because people going into making a Switch 2 game know that it's weaker, and then therefore, because they still have to try to support, frankly, still PS4 games sometimes, and Series S and Xbox One S support half the time now, I feel like because the Switch 2 has GPU that is probably close to the Series S, but more RAM, that it has a realistic balance that will probably be supported by more AAA games at first than the original Switch was. The only thing I see is the CPU holding it back long term. But
yeah, so for my game specifically, I can ship 2K and 4K textures on Xbox and PlayStation 5, right? So Switch 1 is in this weird it's a mobile phone that's got more RAM and an active fan kind of vibe going on. But the Switch 2 is looking like we're going to about to ship decently sized PC textures on it. And it's going to be a lot more sustainable, at least for my game going forward. Like I can probably bump up the settings and increase the textures, ship larger textures. Previously on Switch 1, Nintendo would actually tell you off for using textures too large, right? Like there'd be all these like, your game's too big, cut it down. You know, the Switch only has a 1080p screen. You need to cut your textures down. Like that would be the answer. Like, so hopefully that kind of gets solved. But for games, I'm more worried about games that feel like they have to ship on Switch 1 and send ship between the console. Like if Switch 2 doesn't take off like we expect it to, a developer's going to have to do this weird sim ship thing where Switch 1's like the Series S, right? And it's
oh god,
this,
and
like,
the difference is so much more than the Series S to X.
It's like you know, Nintendo is going to want to keep this subscription service going with Nintendo Online and the shared user base between the two Switches long term. Like 50% of users are still on PS4, right? For Sony. Sure. So this is these consoles have a very long shelf life now. So is Switch 1 going to be this dragging on Series S kind of worse version? And like,
I just don't think it can be. It's too weak, right? I mean,
one of them shipping like, well, if you think about how many units it sold more units than PS2 or whatever. Those units are not going to upgrade right away, right? And is Nintendo going to restrict games to be the Switch 2 only? Or are they going to keep, like, the next Zelda comes out, is it going to sim ship, right? Hopefully not, but developers might feel like they have to because of the install base. Right? Like, the reason why devs like shipping on Switch now is because it's just a numbers standpoint. By pure numbers, they just have more consoles sold. It's just uncapped the play base that could buy your game, right? And that's kind of, if they're stuck sim shipping, I feel like games are going to have a rough time. But if it can sell enough units where people can not worry about the Switch 1 and just kind of keep it on Skeleton Crew's live service, then maybe it'd be okay. Because I mean, I'm stuck updating my game for Switch 1 for the next however long, 10 years, 5 years, right? And I'm going to have two versions of my game, one the Switch 1 version, one Switch 2 version. We don't really know how the backwards compatibility will work, but theoretically, people can just grab a Switch 2 and boot up my game. So I'm going to, like, it's going to be weird to figure out how the actual system works, if it's a separate version of the game, if I can just do an update to the Switch 1 game, and if Switch 2 run this thing instead. But depending on how that works technically, that's going to be the interesting note for people, right?
Yeah, you know, I interviewed the Spirit of the North devs, and it was funny. They were like, they launched on Steam. It did okay, and Steam's good. You know, they recommend your game over and over, so they were getting sales. It went to PlayStation, it did well, but when they finally got that Switch port out, they were like, sales just took off. And it's like, from that perspective, I think at a minimum, indie devs are going to have to support the Switch for a very long time. I think we're going to get to a point where just modern games can't run on it, but if you're a smaller studio, you have to have that install base.
Yeah, if you remember Destiny 1, they had this period where they were on the Xbox 360, Xbox One, and Xbox Series X. And they kind of had to do this thing where on the 360, they just kind of abandoned the game at some point in some update cycle. Right? So I wonder, especially for
I didn't know that. That's interesting. But
especially for a multiplayer live service game, I know on the 360, they just blocked you from updating your game at some point. I wonder what it's going to be like with Switch 2, because I think a lot of games will rely on, hey, this is Switch 2 enhanced, right? And not necessarily getting a brand new title.
Even though the difference in performance is at least a generation, you know?
Right? So it's going to be like this PS5 Pro split on the Switch platform because of the cross compatibility, right? Even now with PS4, people are running a lot of PS4 games on PS5. And you can go back to your PS4 game and say, hey, if you're on a PS5, even though you're on a PS4 game, increase the resolution or do this thing. So depending on how the developer adds support, they could update the Switch 1 game and have a check if Switch 2 do this, or they could release a whole new version of their game, or they could do some kind of enhancement. And I think depending on what strategy they play, we'll see a lot of Switch enhanced games rather than brand new Switch games, Switch 2 games.
All right, so I want to pivot to a couple of final discussions that I know you wanted to have as well. Chris Rich writes in, he says, gaming on Windows on ARM with Qualcomm has been terrible. How much of this, though, would you put down to Qualcomm's GPU drivers versus down to the OS working with ARM itself? If you think it's mostly drivers, then would you expect gaming to be fairly smooth on AMD's Soundwave or NVIDIA's ARM APUs, since their drivers should be a lot better than Qualcomm's? And I have heard that, by the way. Half of it really is not ARM emulation. It's the drivers from Qualcomm for the GPU.
Yeah, so this is one of those things where I started doing the Qualcomm thing for fun. I thought it'd be cool for, the Moore's Law is Dead audience. I've been posting in the Discord every few weeks saying, hey, this is what like porting on ARM. Like I did a video with Wendell where we talked about the whole ARM is harm kind of thing going on with Microsoft and ARM. And I thought, hey, this is like Battlemage is not worth supporting, but ARM is 100 times less worth supporting, right?
Because they're not going to advertise your stuff as much either, right? So you're not getting that benefit, really, are you?
Like, I feel like I'd rather forgive Intel for Raptor Lake and work with Intel on Battlemage than deal with Qualcomm on some of this stuff, right? But the attitude for keep in mind, I bought a Snapdragon dev kit and it got canceled after I already bought it, right? And they said the quality was substandard. Like, what? It's complete insult to like, hey, buy a dev kit, wait for months, support your game. By the way, we canceled it. So with my game, I got it working perfectly. We got it ported on Unreal 5.3.
Was it that hard? And it directly uses ARM?
Yeah, we've got an ARM native version. Now, the problem I had is when I was working with the BattleEye guys on support, they told me, hey, Matt, don't bother porting your game to ARM. No one's doing it. Like, stop doing this. Like, what are you doing? Like, we made the driver work for it, but even bigger games are not supporting ARM. Like, what are you doing? Like, this is stupid, right? So we modded Unreal Engine 5.3 to work on ARM, which was a crap ton of work. I had to backport stuff from Unreal 5.5 and 5.6 to the older version of Unreal to get it to work. And I found out that the Visual Studio compiler for ARM is broken and generates code for ARM that crashes and bad instructions. That Windows is very buggy on ARM, but the drivers for Qualcomm have to be the worst thing. And it's not like NVIDIA. Like if you have a driver crash on NVIDIA, there's tools where you can debug it. You can grab a crash dump and you can email your NVIDIA rep and say, hey, my GPU crashes. For ARM, I post on the driver feedback forum. And the driver feedback forum is kind of passive aggressive. It's like, OEMs don't really support this. Go to your OEM. Even though my OEM is Snapdragon because I have the dev kit, right? It's confusing. We found out that they released a beta driver for the graphics, and we found out that Lenovo has blocked Qualcomm's driver in their firmware because they used a different signing key. The most craziest thing. So they say, hey, go buy a laptop to dev for ARM. But the GPU drivers have been so bad that OEMs are using different signing keys so Qualcomm can't ship an update that is broken to their device. That's how bad it is. So I've got 2 Qualcomm devices now, and luckily I was lucky enough to buy one that wasn't blocked for Qualcomm drivers. And I've tried their beta driver. I've tried their current production driver. My game crashes on boot now on 5.5. I opened a ticket about it in last year sometime. We never got a response. I've been, bugging them about it. So far, I talked to Intel about ARM because Intel makes this compiler. I think it's an ISPC or IPSC compiler. And Intel has helped me more for ARM than ARM actually has, right? So
you mean Qualcomm has? Or
yeah, Qualcomm, right? So when I went to Intel and said, hey, your compiler is broken on ARM, they're like, well, we don't want to use a Qualcomm device, but we can use this Ampere device with Windows running on it to fix your problem. And they fixed the problem for me on the Ampere device. And Qualcomm doesn't want to help me out. I'm in the Snapdragon Insiders Discord, right, last night. And they released this new Snapdragon processor that's like, we lost 2 cores and more than over half of the GPU performance, like this Snapdragon non-elite X
That's where I start
version,
worrying about
right?
the GPU even being strong enough to like
They want
do
to
for
target
non-gaming.
$600 for a device. It sounds like a disaster. Like if I'm porting my game to Snapdragon now and you're releasing a chip that has 60-75% GPU nerf, what's the point? Like, is that going to be the highest sold Qualcomm device now, and my game's going to run worse than the worst version of the Elite processor?
Well, and I need to remind people there are $600 AMD Hawkpoint convertible tablets with nice screens and nice touch screens. Like they're not like budget crap. And it's like, I don't know how this can be competitive. This needed to have launched 2 years ago to make sense at $600. But much more interesting to me then is you seem pretty sure, am I wrong then, that the issue with Snapdragon's performance on Windows is Snapdragon. It's not ARM.
Yeah, like the thing is like people have phones now with devices on it on Android that can emulate Windows and run Fallout, right? Like the very latest processor. So the drivers in Windows seem to be the biggest problem, with the drivers being the worst thing. But the developer support is extremely bad. Like Intel gives me better support for Battlemage, like I said, than Qualcomm. I'm just worried that they're just they had this launch plan for a while for $600. It's not competitive. Every single launch they had, the last 3 launches, has not been competitive, and they have a X Elite 2 they want to launch next year. So what is the point, right, on supporting this thing? If AMD processors are cheaper, AMD is claiming 24 hours of battery life in their keynote. Did you see that one?
Yeah. Kraken, I think, could be a very important product for AMD because ultimately, Hawkpoint's already in $600 laptops, and it costs about the same to make as the Qualcomm X Elite, so it's not surprising they can sell it for that much with the volume they have. Which this has been reported publicly. Like the volume for the X Elite is very low, so AMD probably has economy of scale advantages here too. And then Kraken, we're going from 8 Zen 4 to 4 Zen 5 and 4 Zen 5C. Overall, that should be a stronger CPU. You're going from a 16 tops to 50 tops NPU. You're going from 12 to 8 compute units, but again, better per compute unit. I think what AMD may pull off is a smaller die size than Hawkpoint, but better than it in every way. And they're already selling Hawkpoint for $600. Maybe this could hit $500. I really don't see how Qualcomm, with their half as good as the X Elite product, is going to compete with something probably comparable to Hawkpoint at the same price point.
Yeah, there was another thing I wanted to mention about Qualcomm while we were talking about it, is they did a video around when CES went up where they claimed that Copilot PCs, 95% of the Copilot PCs in the world that shipped were Qualcomm, like they're the best Copilot PC thing. Did they just beat, it's like technically very misleading, but could be true based on not factoring in the AMD and Intel ones as technically Copilot or some kind of technical aspect like that, right? Like if you say, hey, these AMD things don't meet the tops or some kind of requirement,
but the new ones do. They did just come out, to be fair.
Like,
but I know they're
today,
selling well.
we're 95% of the Copilot PC thing.
To be honest, I have no idea where they got that from. Because I guess I don't know how well Lunar Lake's selling for sure. I don't think it's very high volume comparative to their other stuff. And I guess technically only Strix and soon Kraken's not out. Strix Halo isn't out. But I don't know. If I had to guess, they were referencing something from like a month ago that was sold, and not counting all of the AMD ones and Intel Lunar Lake ones that weren't certified yet, but actually are Copilot Plus capable. That'd be my guess. If it was like 75%, I'd be like, oh, I don't know. It's probably because Strix just launched. 95, I think that's what they did, is they're just not counting them.
Yeah, like technically, like if Microsoft said, hey, we're not counting any of these chips yet, you have 95%. They also made
you have 1 week to claim this.
They also, they say as of today, so like they picked the perfect day while other chips are launching to say that. But they also claim stuff like, hey, 90% of the Copilot time is spent using Windows apps that run natively.
Mm-hmm.
That's the biggest load of crap I've ever seen. I've even downloaded like their example games like Baldur's Gate and 3 and stuff like that they say there's an ARM native version. When I run the version off Steam, it's still running an emulation. Like it doesn't use the ARM version. So all these claims about everything being on ARM and everything running great is just not true and just wrong.
But again, where I want to go with this conversation is, I mean, it looks like Windows could work on ARM, and NVIDIA might launch an APU that I've leaked, I think a couple months ago at the end of this year. They'll probably save it for CES 26, if I had to guess. But it sounds like you think actually that NVIDIA ARM APU may be very, very good and run fine on Windows.
Yeah, so the way I've been talking to Qualcomm about giving them feedback about how to launch this thing properly. And I think NVIDIA knows how to launch this properly, right? Like when the 50 series GPU comes out, they go message a bunch of developers and they say, hey, we're going to send you 2 free 5090s. Go add neural rendering or go add DLSS 4. And we're going to support you, right? And so when they launch an ARM-powered device, they're going to go to developers and they're going to say, hey, we're sending you free laptops. We're sending you free devices. We're going to give you
have
engineering
a whole tech
support.
day to teach you how to do it.
We're going to have a ticket system. So if you need help, we're going to support you.
Oh my God, a ticket system. Wow.
Our GPU drivers are probably going to be based on our current, things, and they will work and we'll support that. We'll have the driver experience. Like we will use NVIDIA app, and the drivers are going to be run by us and updated automatically and stuff like that. The Qualcomm drivers, every OEM stands behind driver updates. Like some Qualcomm devices, if you're unlucky and bought the wrong Lenovo laptop from Qualcomm, your drivers are from May. Like it's even worse than the current production ones. So I think NVIDIA knows how to support developers if they have the right people. That's like, hey, give out, free devices. Go to the top 100 games on Steam and say, hey, just free laptop. We're going to support you. They will rapidly, like, even if it runs Steam OS or some crazy other thing, they will, know how to support it properly. Now, the question we have is with Windows and the ARM restriction of Windows is very set on Qualcomm being the Copilot PC partner. Is NVIDIA going to have trouble with, like, because that seems like a bit of a anti-competitive mess.
Yeah.
Like, could you imagine a, judge in court for, if something's a monopoly on only Windows can run ARM or only Qualcomm can run ARM Windows? That seems like a breaking the market and preventing people from making other ARM devices.
Yeah, that's true. That might be interesting, like, because you can see Microsoft easily screwing over AMD Soundwave because that's what Microsoft does. They screw over AMD, unless they're apparently at their CES press conference to not announce something. But I can't see Microsoft screwing over NVIDIA. Right? Like I feel like what they have right now is I've heard too they spent hundreds of millions of dollars helping Qualcomm develop this chip. So I think there was a bit of like, this is our baby. We need to make sure our baby has a solid first year. I don't understand
where the money went, right? Like that's my thing. Did the money just go on
two sources, like hundreds upon hundreds of millions, maybe even
and
more
I was talking to Wendell about this too, is where did the money go supporting ARM? Did it just go to people working on the Windows kernel and nowhere else? Or did it go to people trying to port apps? Like Discord doesn't even run natively on ARM. It runs horrible. It's the biggest chat app ever. Like, what are they doing with this thing? Like if Apple or Nvidia or another company was tackling this thing, they would just know, hey, every game that doesn't run on ARM is bad. Every app that doesn't run on ARM is bad. That just needs to be fixed. And you can fix it with money. If you show up and say, hey, here's $5,000, add ARM support, we'll support you. That developers just do that. If Xbox came to me and said, hey, you need to add FSSR to your Xbox game, we'll support you, I'll just go do it. Right? I don't understand it's this infinitely fixable problem. If Steam is launching an ARM-based version of Steam OS, like exactly what they're going to do to support it, right? Like they get it.
Yeah, and it's true because Qualcomm makes phones, phone SoCs. Those seem to work. So it's like you would think this could translate into consumer laptop, but it didn't. And I think, or at least not as well as I know they hoped it would. And so I don't know. I would just suggest that I think it's much, much, much more likely NVIDIA does not screw this up because NVIDIA, unlike Qualcomm and seemingly still unlike AMD, understands that when you launch a new thing, it better be your best foot forward, right? And so I think, yeah, especially after talking to you today, there's good reason to believe that these NVIDIA APU laptops could be killer laptops.
Yeah, like we might roast Nvidia about their bad marketing slides,
But then through
you know,
talking about that, we came to the conclusion, oh shit, they trapped AMD. Actually, that
yeah,
was kind of brilliant. It kind
like
of
we
was.
might roast them about it, but there's probably a reason of why they did it that way, and they know how to support developers. I might, disagree where we think, hey, there could be better support, but they're supporting
Yeah,
it
and just
better
because
than.
I say they're smart, everybody listening, doesn't mean I think it's ethical.
Oh yeah, I mean, they could do so much non-ethical stuff.
Yeah,
It would
we're
be
not saying
smart,
it's good. I have
but
to
it's
say
not
that.
good
People will
for.
call us NVIDIA fanboys. We're not saying it's good, but it was smart.
It's bad for consumers, but it's smart from a business strategy standpoint of a game of chess.
Hmm. All right. So the final thing I want to talk to you about is just kind of support on Linux and other things. I'm just going to rapid fire 3 questions and you just bite on what you want.
Sure.
PC Dog writes in and says, with the success of the Steam Deck, do you think more devs will start supporting Linux games? And from a developer perspective, is it more economical to do a full Linux native port or to support Proton and run the Windows game on Linux? Bacon House Collective writes in and says, what kind of adoption would it take for most devs to support Linux games or their anti-cheat software? Do more devs have the proprietary anti-cheat, or is it just always third party when it's an issue? And Chris Trish asks, for game development, how costly is it to support new and different OS and driver versions versus different hardware in general? Please tell me Linux is about to kill Windows.
So this is a very interesting question because I obviously ported my game to Linux because I hate Windows. Right? Like
Mm-hmm.
if we sell zero, Linux copies, I'll be happy to know that if I hate Windows and it blue screens my PC one day, I could swap over and still play my game. Right? We also support our game on Steam OS, even though we're not on Steam. Right? And there's a lot of weird barriers of like if you try to use a keyboard and you're not a Steam game, it's just a lot harder for some reason. Like there's a lot of barriers on Steam OS for non-Steam games. So that's probably the thing I don't like the most about Steam OS is your game has to be on Steam to run smoothly, which I hate. I would, I'd more than happy to support Valve and Steam OS. I love them, but I, don't want to give them 30% of all my money and have all the problems that come with Steam. For Linux though, some of these questions I can answer in one answer, big answer. Security standpoint, it's interesting because Linux is technically open source and supposedly more secure and more awesome, but it's a lot more open. Like you can write your own kernel and compile it from source code and install it on your Steam Deck. You can shade in so many interesting creative ways. And I think a lot of developers, even though the Steam Deck is infinitely popular, they're like, hey, screw the Steam Deck. Like, you don't have a bad business decision you have to make to go, I'm GTA. We're going to retroactively break our game on Steam Deck through BattleEye, even though BattleEye supports Linux natively. Like, you really have to have a really bad cheating problem to say, screw the Steam Deck users, Because we're a BattleEye game and we work on Steam Deck, right? So I think the problem is cheating is so bad on games where companies worth millions of dollars are all powered by cheats, right? And technically cheating on Windows on ARM could be a huge thing too, but people can't be bothered because it barely works, right? So, like, why would you write, and this is the answer I have about cheating is the best anti-cheat is making your game boring, right? Because no one buys it. Like the cheaters don't buy it because it's boring. So,
and I don't know if I brought this up to you. It probably was you the last time you were on, where I said, why is it that like Battlefield 2042 has no cheaters? And I think it was you or someone else said, well, it's popular enough that it's popular, but it's not as popular as Battlefield 1 was. So not everyone's playing it.
So, as a game developer, if you're starting out, cheating is a good thing because it means your game's fun and people want to cheat in it. So, my concern with the SteamOS and Linux is it's going to get popular, but cheating's still so bad where it's still not worth supporting, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of where at the moment, if Valve can promise there's going to be some operating system level protection in SteamOS and some verification thing in the hardware that's going to protect games, I think we'd just see cheat vendors on SteamOS right away, right? But if Valve's going to keep it open, which, open is nice, we like open, but open's very bad for the cheating front. A lot of people kind of make comments about kernel level anti-cheats where they say,
Compressai iBlock says, is kernel level anti-cheat actually required, or is it just the easiest way to provide feedback and catch cheaters for devs? I get why you might want this, but there are some pretty hefty downsides either with privacy or low-level access to your PC. I recently started playing Delta Force, and it uses this type of anti-cheat. Hasn't totally bothered me, but it's something I have to keep in mind, and I would prefer if I didn't have to.
Yeah, so from a security standpoint, I think non-kernel level anti-cheats are better. Like, they're more secure, technically. They just suck for finding cheaters, right? And that's kind of the main problem is cheating is so bad, for example, where...
I mean, it's kind of ruined every Call of Duty I played a month after it comes out.
We have to have Battleline and has to scan your PC all the time to find cheats, right? And sometimes the anti-cheat finds viruses because viruses are injecting into the game and the anti-cheat's blocking them accidentally because it like, hey, this, WordPad is injecting into Path of Titans. What's going on? It's just a virus that happened to be on there and Battlei's blocking it or whatever. Now, there's an argument for, hey, kernel level anti-cheats are because developers are lazy and they could use a server-side anti-cheat instead, and that would be more secure. The way server-side anti-cheats work is a lot of them work on statistics, and if you've done too many headshots that are unrealistic, we're going to ban you. That server-side anti-cheats work and should be implemented and are good, but there's a lot of false positives where somebody that's really good at aiming might behave exactly like a cheater.
Yeah, it's not every battle, but I think I remember once in Battlefield 5, I went like 60-2. Everyone called me a cheater or something,
Yeah, so when people cheat, they start off with cheats like, we're going to spawn parachuting cows and we're going to spawn I remember playing DZ and the cheaters be like, we're going to spawn cows on a parachute and we're going to spawn tanks, and tanks weren't in the game, right? They were just in armor in the mod and they spawn tanks. So when the developers say, hey, if you're spawning a tank, ban you, they start being more subtle. So like first they're spawning tanks, then they're killing people, then they're flying around the map and clipping through walls. Once all those things get patched, they're very easily patchable through server validation. The only thing they have left that's open is two things. They have one thing that's like, we can hack the mouse and keyboard to have input that auto aims and auto does stuff, or they can have ESP where they see people behind walls and stuff. Now, some of the ESP stuff can be solved by, if you're behind a wall, don't replicate the player to your camera. So like even if you're cheating, you can't see them. But somebody that's visible that isn't behind a wall, but it's not immediately obvious, maybe they're in a bush or maybe they're
behind a fence or something.
They're close enough where we can't hide them out of the replication graph, but they're still within your field of view that you can't immediately see. That's when cheats work, right? So all it is inject into the game and show, like, light all the players up in pink, right? Is what they would do. And so you just get tracked onto and shot. Now, from a server-side anti-cheat perspective, it's almost impossible to detect that ESP kind of cheat where they're just in their radius, right? This is funny from my game. We have mushrooms in the game, and dinosaurs go and collect mushrooms. Hackers make a cheat that makes all the mushrooms on your screen in front of you pink or glow or whatever, because they're like lazy and don't want to find them or whatever. And technically, they're all visible and they're all right there, but they edit the game to make it easier, right? And that's the kind of cheat you can't detect server-side because the user's not doing anything wrong, right? And so for FPS games especially, we need something running on your PC to block the ESP level that's in front of you, because all the weird behavior, like some people will speed hack and they'll be like 0.01% faster than everybody else. And it's such a small threshold where it's barely detectable, right? And that's what they'll do. Where if developers are very bad at the game, all the hacking is obvious, spawning cows, jumping around. But if developers are really good and got the cheating very fine-tuned, the last thing left is this one thing.
Yeah, and if they're 1% faster, you'll get to the map, you'll get to the B out of A, B, and C in Battlefield. You will get there before the enemy, and you will be throwing grenades down the hallway before they could have gotten to the base.
And the other thing as well is you have to use a lot of server compute, where if you want to find somebody that's only 1% faster but didn't like lose connection or accidentally teleport or glitch out or whatever, or like false positives.
Do you remember lag switches on like the original Xbox, PS2? Like,
yeah, people still do this, right? Where they like disconnect the internet, you run and shoot someone, you plug it back in. Some of this stuff's detectable, but some of it is literally impossible to fix in any way. You're welcome to like leave a comment or a theory on how you might patch this. But in my experience of doing this for 10 years, it's very hard to patch. Now, there is heuristic detection where you can download the cheat, reverse engineer it, and patch it.
That's a lot of work.
You know, we had this in our game where we had a Chinese site that was selling hacks. They would rotate the domain name every 30 days. So, like, you'd go to, like, my cheating site, whatever, and then next week it'd be called a completely different name, and then the week after it would be called a completely different name. So, like, constantly rotating. And the cheats basically are like viruses now. Like when you download a cheat, it can encrypt your hard drive. Like you have to have a Faraday cage and a separate internet connection and a security expert to reverse engineer it. So the amount of time to find what the cheat does, and they do stuff like detect if it's in a VM, so you can't like run the cheat and you know, this is what the Battleline guys do and the Easy Cheat guys do, is they buy the cheat for $30, reverse engineer it. The problem we had with this was they had this concept called trusted cheats, where you need to go cheat in CSGO for 2 years to become a trusted cheater, and then we'll sell you the cheat. Right?
Oh my gosh.
Like this is a real thing. Where like because our anti-cheat's so good, they have trusted cheats where we'd have to hire someone to play CSGO for 2 years and cheat in CSGO, buy the cheat, and then reverse engineer the cheat, and then get banned. And at that point, you're like, my God, this is so freaking annoying to deal with. And you're kind of, it's definitely a cat and mouse game. So that's the reason, like GTA, for example, the reason why it doesn't run on Steam Deck is there's some kind of cheat that they don't want to run. And Steam Deck's just not worth the hassle. Because, you know, even if they want to buy the cheat and block it on SteamOS, they can, you know, the 2-year thing or something else, right?
Dark Side of the Force writes in, what do you think would be the tipping point for a big multiplayer game to adopt SteamOS specifically? And what is the pain point that prevents them from doing it any sooner? I think we already talked about that in the cheaters. Or let me see. Yeah, so it sounds like he's like, well, a kernel level anti-cheat's there for this reason, because it is so much work and you actually have to do that if you want to try to have any attempt at removing most cheaters. How popular do you think SteamOS would have to be for them to go, okay, fine, we have to support SteamOS?
So there was an Xbox call that was made, or Xbox conference where they talked about the security, where even Intel Secure Boot is insecure because the South Bridge asks if it should have Secure Boot or not, right? So security, the reason why Xbox doesn't have a mass cheating problem is it's secure by design and secure in hardware. And even on Windows now, there's cheats that check if you have a TPM and check if you have a recent processor, and they load the anti-cheat at boot time to make sure, like, you'd have this problem where someone would load the cheat and then close it. And so what Steam would need to do is release some hardware like a console that is certified to be secure with a signed operating system that they can certify is not being tampered with. If they do that, cheating might be impossible, like really hard to do. Right? And developers would battle run on Steam without even having an anti-cheat because the platform would be secure. Now,
or like, yeah, I think about that too. And it is actually a decision I make now, like for multiplayer games. Like if I get it on PC, well, I just play against AI with my brother on Age of Empires, so there's no cheater issue there. You're not gonna have a cheater issue in Deep Rock Galactic. It's co-op that can be on, but there are some multiplayer games where I do think I might want it on. Well, now most games are cross-platform, so it doesn't matter, actually. This was more of a consideration 10 years ago where it's like, like an exclusive online game, which Sony doesn't really make many of those anymore for PlayStation. You know there won't be cheaters though, because it's a secure device for
Yeah,
the
and
most part.
Xbox has some requirements now where they request that if you have crossplay, you have proper anti-cheat set up on PC,
They should.
because the cheating will affect console, right? They don't want their console being hacked into.
It really
So,
pisses me and my brother off if we're playing Call of Duty and then we even play a version that's on PlayStation and there's still cheaters. It's like, good lord.
yeah, like to cheat on a PlayStation, you'd have to get like a PlayStation dev kit, reverse engineer the firmware, and figure out how to bypass the update check. And even then, Sony's going to update it.
And they're very litigious about you hacking their PlayStation.
So I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but I feel like Valve is not going to do the secure platform thing because they want the platform to be open for everyone to mess with. And they also have this thing with VAC, because people make this argument. It's like, Valve has VAC, and VAC is great. Well, first off, VAC bans nothing unless you report, like, you file cheats with it. And they have this thing in Counter-Strike, which is interesting, where they record a replay of the server and play it back and use machine learning. This is another thing. I don't think the AI anti-cheats work either, is another thing. Like, we tried an AI anti-cheat for our game, and I got banned from my own game for pressing the shift key too many times, right?
Oh, okay.
They're like, you're using an auto clicker. We're going to ban you. Like, what? A playing my own game. So I think if Valve decided we're going to go down this secure direction, they could have the whole market and developer support. Like GTA, the next GTA would be on multiplayer on SteamOS, secure and supported day one. But while they're not doing that, while SteamOS doesn't have a lot of adoption, it's not worth doing. And if Valve made those,
do you think there's a path to that though? Do you think there could be some situation where Valve continues to sell or like have SteamOS supported, Steam Deck 2 becomes popular, and eventually they go, guess what, Steam Deck 3, there is going to be a signed version of it, and now the new Lenovo whatever is also going to have a signed version.
And they could do it like Android. So with what we do with Android is you can unlock the boot ROM and use a custom OS, but you just don't get those multiplayer games with SG, right? So if they did a setup where the platform's still open, but if you can unlock the root ROM and edit it, but otherwise if you use a locked version, it's secure and non-tampered with as much as possible, I think developers would support it. No problem. Mm-hmm. So it's just that decision is holding everything back.
It's not a market share thing.
It's not a technical thing. You know, it's not a like Linux is hard. We don't know how to make Linux games. Like everyone knows how to make Linux games. There is problems with Linux development, right? But the hard thing is a security thing, you know?
Okay. Well, unless there's anything else you wanted to talk about, I think maybe we could end it there.
No time to talk about Intel's Keynote that much.
If you want to, we can talk about it.
Sure. But my concern was just their lack of content compared to the other keynotes, and AMD was showing out OEMs like we have Dell and we have, you know, this ASUS person is going to put all of their laptops on AMD now, and Intel has nothing. So I'm worried that going forward, you know, future Intel laptop launches and future launches is going to be, you know, tramped on by AMD's, you know, Pro Max Plus.
Pro Max AI Plus thing. Yeah, I mean, it should be, you know, and again, I saw some people having these odd takes online that are just like, well, why wasn't RDNA 4? That should be the most important thing AMD has. It's not. The most important thing for AMD to talk about is their laptop CPUs. That's making them all of their money right now. And that is, yeah, I mean, I didn't watch the Intel keynote. I barely had enough energy to watch the NVIDIA and AMD one, frankly. But if you saying that there wasn't a ton of developer discussion.
Yeah, there was like, you know how AMD had Xbox on? There was no OEMs in Intel's keynote. There was a whole bunch of AI, whole bunch of Arrow Lake. They said, "Hey, we launched great graphics," and I think the quote was that they're going to keep supporting graphics regardless. You know, don't know how true that is, but that just seems like a bit of marketing BS to me. But
no, yeah, but they can support graphics, and it can be in an integrated APU. You know, like I have no doubt they're going to keep making integrated graphics whatsoever, you know, but is that the same as having a 5090 competitor and a 6090 competitor? It's not. And that's what they promised us. But, yeah, I mean, I guess I will say there was a question that I kicked out while we were talking. but I'll bring it up now. It basically, I forgot who asked it, but it basically asked, um, if Intel Battlemage has horrible margins, then why do they have so much AIB support?
Or
They
yeah,
don't. Where's ASUS? Where's PNY? Where's MSI? The fact that they have to go to Gunner, who's selling it for $400 on Newegg or something, that tells you right there the real AIBs don't want to support Battlemage.
yeah,
And it's actually shocking they haven't.
I have a Gunner GPU, and it feels like a bit of a beta product, but let's say I'm an OEM and I'm launching my brand new OEM brand. Even if Intel has no stock, even if it's just a paper launch, launching a GPU as an OEM gets my name out there somewhat better than nothing.
So it's crazy that like HP and Dell don't want Battlemage graphics cards. It's crazy.
Probably just not worth it, and probably not worth the hustle, right? I know we talked about MSI. Was it MSI had a bad relationship with AMD or something like that? I was trying to remember.
They've been pivoting more and more and more to Intel and now NVIDIA for years.
So it's just one of those things where, running a company and dealing with the vendors, just like EVGA and NVIDIA, you have the vendor lie to you. You have the vendor cause problems. You have bugs that don't get fixed. So dealing with Intel might have some problems and just a surprising lack of support, right?
Mm-hmm.
5 years from now, are we going to see a drought in Intel laptops for support, right? Like that's definitely a concern on my side, especially if Arrow Lake performance sucks. Now, there is arguments to be made that Arrow Lake in laptops might be more power efficient or might be better in some cases, but I'm generally concerned about it not being a hit.
But yeah, and like when people bring up Lunar Lake handhelds, which most, at least the benchmarks I saw on the Fox, seem to suggest that Lunar Lake wasn't more efficient than Strix in a handheld. I think people are forgetting AMD hasn't even launched the Z2 Extreme. That's the bin voltage controlled handheld variant that really would compete with Lunar Lake at that price and TDP range. And that's not even out yet. So yeah, I don't know. I just don't have much to say about it.
Yeah, I have an MSI and Chlorine. It sucks. It's just, I don't think Intel's going to take off in the handheld speakers, unfortunately.
Like our mothers said, if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything. So no, I will not be covering the Intel keynote in all that much depth because frankly, I just find the AMD and NVIDIA stuff, and especially the NVIDIA conference, infinitely more interesting.
Is it worth talking about in CES how much the word AI was used everywhere? I have this image, I don't know if you saw it, of NVIDIA's revenue for AI versus GPUs. Did you see that one?
Yeah, I did. I don't have much to say about it, but what I would say is, yeah, you have a chart there that basically shows over time that gaming is not their revenue.
If this chart is believed, I'm sure you can put up that's like 17% of revenue for GPUs versus 78 for data center and AI.
Yep, it went from 78 gaming to now 78% AI. From that perspective, it's kind of crazy actually NVIDIA isn't charging $3,000 for the 5090. I'm being honest. Like there's some degree there where it has to be Jensen's ego in a good way, like we're not losing gaming. We're not going to do it. You're not going to buy the market from us.
Like they could just not worry about the GPU space that much and just focus on AI. It's at 78%. But it seems like the AI is subsidizing some of the GPU development here at this point. And maybe that's why GPUs have so many AI features now, is it's all being paid for by the AI part. And they're just kind of,
what NVIDIA decided to do with graphics cards is we're going to build them, I would argue, for AI first at this point. And what AMD would say is, well, that's a lot of wasted silicon. And then NVIDIA is like, well, we have so much money, we will make our developers find a way to use the AI components for gaming. And even though it looks blurry to a lot of people, they have figured out a way to do that, and it is working out for them. And so I think there's that. I also think, by the way, the reason NVIDIA isn't going to let AMD get a clean win with RDNA 4, which clearly they're not when we look at the pricing. Although, again, let's see if that pricing ends up fake. It did for Battlemage. But if it doesn't end up fake, and it wouldn't surprise me if it isn't, it's just because NVIDIA knows if this AI bubble pops in a year, they need to be able to swoop right back into gaming. And they're just, I think of it kind of like an insurance policy. if this bubble pops, and it will, I mean, all bubbles pop. It doesn't mean AI is fake. It just means it's a bubble. The internet didn't go away when the .com bubble, but like they know they can't completely alienate their fan base. And I think that's what they're proving with Blackwell.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I think that's a good place to end it on, though. But I want to thank you again for coming on. I mean, I know I will certainly have you on again if you'd ever be interested in it, because this has, again, been a very illuminating discussion. But before I let you go, please tell people where to find you and please promote your stuff.
Sure, it's AlderonGames.com and PathOfTitans.com if you want the game. And I'll also be, I guess, posting stuff about the Intel thing if I hear any news about Intel crashing more. I could see if I can export some of the crash data and just release some public numbers on, I could have a counter that's like how many times Intel's crashed in my game or something like that.
I bet if you did that, you get Gamers Nexus to cover it again, see if we get any follow-ups with Intel.
Yeah, so as a game developer, it's kind of hard because talking bad about a GPU vendor or Intel or company is probably the worst thing you can do from a game dev standpoint, because all I have to lose is upsetting my relationship with a vendor and getting less support. So there's a reason why a lot of game devs don't speak out about practices being bad, is because it's not really a great thing, right? Obviously, you don't care about it because I'm indie, but it's one of those things.
No, but there's a lot of developers I talk to where this happens behind the scenes. They're like, have you seen this thing NVIDIA's doing? Can you talk about it? Because I know I sure as hell can't, right?
So, yeah, I just want to find online that I appreciate everybody that covered the Raptor Lake thing, because it really supported my company when I needed it. And I appreciate your coverage on stuff like that, because it really makes an impact. And a lot of this just show is covering aspects that I don't see in other reviews and other media. So, like I said, really appreciate you having me on.
Mm-hmm. And I do it because I'm just a weird obsessive person who likes talking about this stuff. So I thank you for giving me more stuff to talk about, frankly. But okay, so yeah, again, on that note, good transition would be, if you want to support Moore's Law is Dead, support us on Patreon. You'll get access to asking guests like these questions. Die Shrinks will be a new Die Shrink this week, of course. They'll come out for free with no ads. You get access to the Discord. You can talk to people like Matt. I mean, there are Intel and Nvidia and AMD employees. I know some of them. I know some of them I just suspect lurking in the Moore's Law is Dead Discord as well, that you guys can speak with.
Also, the Intel shareholders you can talk to.
Mm-hmm.
But the Discord for me is one of the most interesting aspects of supporting the channel on Patreon, because compared to a lot of other Discords, there's a lot of arguments in there that have very intelligent discussion. I get, there's copium sometimes and stuff like that, but compared to a lot of other Discords, this Discord has a lot of creative discussion in it.
Well, yeah, and I won't name names. There are some people that I rarely agree with, but it's only if they're like, just posting wildly inappropriate stuff, or like, and we've had this before, we've had to ban them. Like, we don't ban people for disagreeing, but there will be people whose first statement is just a bunch of slurs and swear words for you disagreeing with what they said this much. And it's like, well, that's not adding. But like, even if you don't agree, this is a real opinion that a lot of people probably hold online. And now we get to talk about it. Even if we don't agree with you, if I think for some people, like, clearly you're just cherry picking the numbers here, but that's a real stance a substantial amount of people online seem to have. And so, of course, we allow that discussion as well. I think we've stumbled into quite a good balance, actually, on the Moore's Law Discord over the years.
Yeah, for example, like I was building a NAS in there, and I posted like, hey, can I get some help on choices for NAS and stuff like that? And the community is like one of the most helpful communities that I've ever seen. So they really care in there, and you should really support the Patreon and talk to the community in there.
Well, thank you for saying that. But yeah, and of course, also subscribe to the Moore's Law YouTube channel, ring the bell button, subscribe to Broken Silicon on your podcast app of choice. Give us a review on Apple Podcasts. We could use some more reviews there this month. I haven't seen a couple for a while, but and on Spotify, who's just slowly turning into YouTube, it seems. But yeah, all right. Again, thank you, Matt, for coming on. Thank you for everybody for listening and watching, and have a good rest of your week. This podcast was brought to you by the YouTube channel and website Moore's Law is Dead. Moore's Law is Dead and Broken Silicon are trademarks of their creator. Tom. That guy is me, and I am indeed the creator, editor, writer, and showrunner of Moore's Law is Dead podcasts, videos, articles, and other media. However, it's not just me. Moore's Law is Dead is a team, with Broken Silicon co-hosted by my brother Dan, audio editing by Gerard Cortez, renders being done by the industrial designer Jean-Philippe Clermont, and special assistance is also provided by Carmen Cry and Carrie Nosugada as well. Find all of our information at www.mooreslawsdead.com on the About/Support page in the event you do want to hire me for consulting work, hire Gerard for audio work, hire Jean-Philippe for industrial design work, or you're interested in working with Carbon Cry or Carrie Nosugada as well. You can also find our long-term sponsors on that page if you want to show them some love for putting food on our tables. Or you can also mail us some love. You can send letters or hardware donations to the following address: Moore's Law is Dead, P.O. Box 60632 in Nashville, Tennessee, zip code 37206. Although, to be honest, the best way to show Moore's Law is Dead some love is to support us on Patreon. Patrons are what makes Moore's Law is Dead content truly possible. Every month, and really every day, depending on who you're talking about, me, Gerard, Dan, and Jean-Philippe are working tirelessly to provide a steady stream of content that we could not keep doing unless we knew the work was possible without being reliant on sponsors dictating every little thing we put out. Don't get us wrong. We love our sponsors, but we love directly working for you, our fans, much more. If you have any extra money, even a couple free dollars a month, consider supporting us directly on Patreon. Those couple of monthly dollars will get you access to the exclusive podcast Die Shrink, voting on subjects of future podcast episodes, the ability to ask guest questions, and of course, access to the Moore's Law is Dead Discord full of like-minded people who I am sure would love to meet you. I am one of them. Additionally, higher tiers get access to early, ad-free episodes of Broken Silicon, the ability to ask questions in all Broken Silicon episodes and Loose Ends live streams ahead of the recording, and the entire back catalog of Moore's Law is Dead podcasts, in addition to having thanks in the credits of videos and podcasts depending on the tier, with other perks available as well. And hey, if you cannot afford to support us directly every month, please do share Moore's Law is Dead videos and podcasts with friends and family, and on social media and websites like Reddit. And give Broken Silicon a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or your preferred podcast app of choice. All of this does really help us so much. But like I said, this podcast would not be possible without the patrons directly providing predictable and reliable support every month. And so now it is time to give a personal thanks to the greatest of the fans. The following supporters are at the 10 gigahertz or higher supported levels: Brad Medlin, Drew DeFoles, Z Jits, Daniel D, Deke, Nicholas Buckner, Aaron Close, Jan Rauner, Daniel Hyde, MJB1, GZ Ziggy, SNES Chalmers, Toka, Jerem Ferrier, Valcom Alev, Jensen Wang, Jagger Sackers, Art Castro, Chris Trish, Evan Dingle, Compressed AI Blocks, Hal Puma, Shredbird, Holden Mobley, Samuel Loss, Jordan Simkovic, Julian Leak, The Boss Haas, Chrysantine, Jonathan, Franco Frederick, Jake Dude 23, Jake Martin, Zlicky, Nithra Zink, Meat and Pork, Tim Robb, Ian Clifford, Travis Gooding, Mad, Zutsu Taylor, Stephen Coates, Greg, Michael McGee, Patty Cakes, Jamie Witters, Gamers Unite, Amiable Chief, Mark Mitchell, Tommy, Aisha, James Anderson, Mark Raidmaker, Cole Addict, Cameron, Henry Zhang, Wesley Sager, Michelle Pelt, Exapuma, Reginald Ari, Teak Autumn, Winwang, Winstar, Corey Leonard, James I. Raider, Little Germany, Shay, JSMMH, Milton, Melodic Warrior, Brett Jones, Chuck Glidden, McDaffie, Stephen Dick, Justin Bustle, Austin Haggerty, Joe Foot, Brian Scanlon, Hardland, Jensen Ngima, Joseph Kelly, Slush Ba, Him Segung, Tails2299, Neil Val, Verga, Sisyphos, 7771, The Forbidden Juice, Brian Wright, RB Razor, Alex Vega, Dr. J Mad, 3D, Michael Cozy, John Swin, Jeffrey Gentleman, Crystal Joe, Elbergun, Keekum, Solarized 80, Thalo215, Matthew Marlowe, Brian B. Sprutnik, Hudat 42, Cornster 671, Penta Winterhell, Richard Omega Doge, Angel of Cake, Mr. Tiger, John Wick, Boomstick, Curry King 3, Nixie's Mania, Porcelain Oath, Sakosha, State Farm Snake, Armand Vakachura, Rai Hill Chi Bowles, Kevin Kuntz, and Stofe. And of course, thank you to Sahara for the music.